Good evening, dear friends. I am glad to welcome you. Today we are going to talk about one of the most amazing masterpieces of ancient Egyptian art. But I would like my lecture to be about the tomb of the great King Menmaat, who we call Seti by his personal name, and according to the tradition adopted in Egyptology, considered to be the first. So I would like this story to be not only a talk about a great masterpiece. I would like to use the example of this amazing tomb, which became the fruit of the colossal work of the most talented Egyptian artists of the 13th century BC. We have talked about the world view of ancient Egyptians and about the death of the king. Finally, about how fragile great masterpieces are. And today we are going to see how the amazing tombs suffered in the 19th and 20th centuries. But before I start my story, every time I talk about such monuments, I have to repeat that everything you're going to see today, and the visual reaction is absolutely colossal, is nothing compared to this personal impression. If you have such an opportunity, at least once in your life you need to come to Luxor, you need to go to the West Bank, buy a cherished expensive ticket, and at least, I repeat, once in your life to touch with your own eyes, this amazing monument, or rather to plunge into the space of two of the most extensive tombs of ancient Egypt, almost every square centimetre of which is covered with amazing painted reliefs, telling about immortality and about the dream that the masters of Seti I and the great king himself put into the future that he saw for himself in a posthumous state. When today tourists come to the west bank of the Nile, the centre of the Favan necropolis for them, of course, is the Valley of the Kings. In ancient times it bore a completely different name. It was called Tas Etat, the Great Place. And in the landscape that you see today, there is quite little resemblance to the Valley of the Kings, which was once the last haven of the great rulers. Once there were no fences that naturally limit the sand and rocky soil that covers the tombs. It is clear that there was no transport, no ticket office, no tourist trails, and no rest house. There were two wadis here. Wadis are traditionally called after the Arabian dry riverbeds, including the desert. So here once stood the feet of the burial processes, the processes that said goodbye to their kings. There were great widows, royal sons, great wise men, and political and cultural figures of their time. We know that in the centre of the Valley of the Kings there was the great sacred sycamore, the tree of the mother goddess, and this tree was the border between the world of the living, which ended somewhere here on the steps of these famous tombs, and then began a long and difficult journey to another world, which in different eras is described in different ways by Egyptian texts and images. Here in the Valley of the Kings, the tombs of different eras, starting from the 16th and 15th centuries BC and ending with the end of the 11th century BC, tell about the king's death in different ways. Plus, depending on how developed the era was, how high the art of one or another episode of the ancient Egyptian history was, of course, the era of the New Kingdom, it depended a lot on whether the royal tomb would be a masterpiece. In addition, we know that the reign of the king was different, so in some cases, as in our current history, the royal tomb was not completed despite all its magnificence. It welcomed its inhabitant, the deceased king, who was revered as the living embodiment of the god Hora, and after his death he was to become Osiris, the god of immortality, the source of all life and ruler of the world. The history of the Valley of the Kings is the history of the great archaeology of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. I'd like to believe that this necropolis is still intact today, and separate monuments and fragments of Egyptian written sources confirm that significant finds can be found here. But Anyway, at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, when Luxor, the Western Shore, and the great necropolis of Finland became the objects of great European interest, the interest of European tourists, it was clear that there were a lot of people here. Unfortunately, at the time when there was probably no understanding of what the European society faced here, how high these monuments are, how unique they are, many European visitors, tourists, not only dug into the sands and sometimes found a fragment of a true rumour of a certain king. Yes, it was true, but they didn't hesitate to take a knife or a pickaxe and cut a piece of relief from the wall of the royal tomb, or simply take the same knife and carve their nameless name on the wall of the royal tomb of the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. And my friends, despite all this, despite the sadness that reigns in this valley for various reasons, this is the sadness that always reigns in the necropolis, the sadness of commemoration, the memory of these treasures. This is the sadness of the ruined tombs which were robbed by the ancient Egyptians. We know the famous legal papyruses of the 12th, 11th centuries BC, which talk about the looting of royal tombs. We will remember this today. The third sadness is the sadness of those people who saw these tombs almost untouched at the beginning of the contact between Egypt and Europe, but who became the Vandals who built the tombs. So, despite all this above, today's visit to the Valley of Kings is still an absolutely amazing experience. It is an experience that is associated with some special immersion, not only inside the rock, not only inside the ancient Egyptian texts, but also inside yourself. Because the questions that this space asks about immortality, about eternal life, about the experience of another world, about whether a person can create a real masterpiece, all these questions are universal, and they certainly, as it seems to me, echo the soul of every guest who finds the strength to overcome the space and complexity of geography and to be here in order to touch the real heritage of ancient Egypt. One of the wonderful researchers of the Valley of Kings, wonderful in his results at the beginning of the 19th century, was an Italian, Giovanni Battista Belzoni. On the one hand, Belzoni was a very successful person. He was the first early archaeologist, you can call him that. He was a man of amazing fate. I will tell you about him in a few words. He was a man of incredible physical strength. And on the one hand, in the south of Italy, he acted as a circus performer. He raised several people on his hands, and this attraction was incredibly popular. On the other hand, Belzoni was an extraordinary man with an extraordinary mind, and he understood that for an adult man to live in an arena of a circus is probably interesting, but not very worthy. As a result, he becomes the one who, now friends, forgive me please. The career of a circus performer quickly outshone Belzoni, and being a man of extraordinary mind, he also becomes an engineer, and in particular he invents a new pump, a hydraulic system, which, as it seems to him, will be very relevant in the fields of Egypt, which are very dependent on the drying desert. So with this project, he comes to Egypt, and he is quite well received by the Hittites. This story seems interesting, but at the moment when the Great Vizier, who was a famous corruptionist, the Great Vizier understands that he won't gain anything from this invention. He will do everything to make Giovanni Battista stay without Ferman, the great Hittite, and won't get permission to introduce his pump into the constant, regular system of agriculture of modern Egypt. As a result, having invested absolutely all his money, having come up with this idea, having come to Egypt with his wife, very smart lady, by the way, her name was Sarah. She had several children, she had a lot of children. Belsonia is in an incredible crisis. and on the verge of complete loss of means of existence. It is at this moment that he meets those people who begin to look for antiquity in the Nile Valley. They work for different European consuls, Bernardino de Rivetti, Henry Salt, and many other famous people who collected with the help of their trusted collections and then sold them to European museums for a lot of money. So he begins to work for these people. Further, on the Nile, this first archaeology, in which he was both an adventurer and sometimes a vandal, and at the same time a sincere seeker of antiquity, a man who loved Egypt, it is important to emphasize, Belsonia becomes very successful. And this success is also due to the fact that he was lucky. It was Giovanni Battista Belsonia who opened the passage to the burial chamber of the Pyramid of Hathor. He was the first to identify the famous ancient port of Berenica in the southern part of the Red Sea. He finds many unique monuments. Somewhere in one of the cafes in Cairo, he meets an outstanding Swiss traveller, Johann Burckhardt, who tells him about Abu Simbel, about the great temple of Ramses, which is on the head of the royal colossi, buried in the sand. Then our hero goes to the border of Egypt and the future Sudan in order to conduct excavations and look at this temple of Ramses the Great. As a result, Giovanni Battista Belsonia found himself in Fiva. Here he concentrates on the excavations of the late temples of the Czars on the western bank of the Nile and, of course, in the Favan necropolis. It was in 1817 that he was lucky enough to make the find in the Valley of the Czars that we are going to talk about tonight. It was to him, in the literal sense of the word, that he smiled with the first reliefs. The tomb became a shock for Belsonia. It was in the royal tombs that had been open since the Middle Ages, like many other European tourists, seekers of the antiquity of that time. He had something to compare it to. By the time he started his excavations, started his work in search of new royal tombs in the Valley of the Czars, he was already quite an experienced person. On the one hand, he could appreciate his find, as we are going to see very soon. On the other hand, he treated the world in which he lived at that time as absolutely consumerist. He was not as interested in Egypt itself as he was in the opportunity to resell the finds in Europe, to get rich, to feed his wife and his many children. Being a person whose name was associated with some large finds, such acquisitions of the cultural plan, Belsonia was moving closer and closer to science. He began to analyse monuments, and several of his books, which were extremely popular in Europe in the 19th century, they were written under the strict control of his wife Sarah, who, unlike his wife, had a good literary style. These books were not only the books of tomb raiders, as Belsonia often presents in modern Egyptology. These are the books of a person who got into an absolutely amazing world, a world that, on the one hand, gave him an opportunity to make a living, and on the other hand, this amazing culture could not transform him. The shock to Egypt, the shock to masterpieces, the shock to the Tsars takes place. So the main find of Belsonia is the tomb of Tsar Seti I. For today's lecture, I have translated fragments from his notes, which were never published in Russian. Before I read these amazing lines, which I think speak the best way about Belsonia, I will show you both the portrait of our first discoverer and his very funny sketches. He, as he could, began to sketch the monuments he found. These drawings are, of course, an absolute monument of his time. Then he invited one of the Italian painters, Nicola Ricci, who helped to make these drawings more perfect. But anyway, in several libraries in Great Britain, first of all, and in Italy, these first sketches were preserved, which are probably far from the perfection of Egyptian reliefs and drawings, which in fact were, of course, in the Tsar's tombs. But anyway, this is the work of Belsonia himself, and this is his story, the story of the first discoverer of the great tombs of the Tsar's Valley. On October 16th, 1817, I continued my excavations in Bibano-Maluk and found a good place which covered all the difficulties I encountered during my research. I can call this good day probably one of the happiest in my life. Fortune brought me that satisfaction, that incredible joy which cannot be achieved by wealth, the pleasure of discovering what we have been looking for so long, the pleasure of presenting to the world a new and perfect monument of Egyptian antiquity. The tomb, which can be described as superior to all others in grandeur, style and safety, appeared as if it had just been completed the day we entered it. I ordered to remove the soil under the foot of a steep hill under the stream, which, when filled with rain, poured a very large amount of water to the very place where I ordered to dig. No one could imagine that the ancient Egyptians would make an entrance to such a majestic and vast structure exactly where the stream of water was formed. However, I had strong grounds to assume that there was a tomb in this place, judging by the signs I received during my research. The Philos, who were busy with the excavation all as one, claimed that there was nothing in this place, since the situation with this tomb was different from everything that had been before. Nevertheless, I continued my work, and the next day at 5 p.m. we realised that the entrance to this part of the rock had been cut off. At 6 a.m, early in the morning, we continued our work, and at about noon the workers reached the entrance, which was 18 feet below the surface of the ground. Everyone said that this was the highest level tomb, but I did not expect to find it as it turned out to be. The Philos moved forward until they saw that the tomb was large. Then they protested and said that they could not work any further, since the passage was filled with such large stones that they would not be able to pull them out. I went down, examined the place, and pointed out where to dig, and within an hour there was enough space to get inside through the void left under the ceiling of the first corridor. Judging by the inscriptions on the ceiling and by the embossed hieroglyphs that were visible where the ground did not reach, I immediately realised that this was the entrance to a large and magnificent tomb. At the end of the corridor, I crawled to the staircase 23 feet long. From its base, I penetrated another corridor. All the walls were painted with carved hieroglyphs. The magnificently preserved ceiling was also painted beautifully. These are the first lines that give us the feeling of delight and Belsonia, and there are some important points for me here. We will soon say goodbye to the portrait of our pioneer. He says that he feels happiness, a joy that cannot be compared with the joy of having wealth. For a tomb seeker, this is a rather serious statement. On the other hand, there is a very important thing that is often forgotten when people talk about the Valley of Kings. In ancient times, when the climate was milder, once every 10 to 15 years, in Fabaida there were heavy rains. I think you have remembered that literally in the place where the tomb was located inside the rock soil, there was a meadow stream that was filled with water from time to time. This was a problem for many tombs of the great place. That is why when we will see traces of water on the painted reliefs of the tomb of Setius I, don't be surprised. You now know the reason. Plus, it is clear that this feature of the Theban necropolis was known to the ancient architects, and therefore it had quite a strong influence on some features of the most perfect royal tombs of the necropolis. It is clear that those documents, those sketches, those stories brought from the Valley of Kings were very different from the original. Therefore, in order to improve the European culture of perception of Egypt at the beginning of the 19th century, I will show you a sketch of Belsonia, one of the most beautiful scenes that were preserved in the first part of the tomb. This is a huge naos in which Osiris is sitting. Behind Osiris is Hathor and Menthed, the great Hathor, the queen of Phobeida, the protector of all the deceased. In front of his heavenly father is Pharaoh Seti I himself, with the sceptres in his hands. Look how gently he touches Osiris's hands, and behind Seti, the far right figure, is the choir of the son of Isis. This is the heavenly prototype of the royal power, which in fact was embodied through many generations of kings on the Egyptian land according to Egyptian religious representations. Despite the fact that the tomb was badly damaged in the 19th century, compare the contours, the faces, the decoration, the details, compare how the hieroglyphic inscriptions were made. So of course, when we talk about the first sketches of the interior elements of the tomb of Seti I, all this is very far from the original. But oddly enough, there will be several such confirmations today. These sketches are important to us because later in the 19th century, Egyptologists came to this tomb. It's just sad to call them that, who cut out fragments of the reliefs for European museums. And sometimes, in addition to the fact that a fragment of the relief was cut out, during this vandal work, part of the neighbouring reliefs collapsed. And we often, based on the drawings of Belzoni and these early travellers, can more or less restore some of the collapsed scenes in the tomb which didn't make it to our time. As a result, Belzoni went to London with his main findings. This old frame from the 19th century depicts a fragment of Piccadilly, where the so-called Egyptian Hall was built. It was a separate museum of William Balloch. It was built not only for Egypt, but also for the rest of the world. The Egyptian style was incredibly fashionable. It was a museum where antiquities, works of art, and subjects related to natural sciences were exhibited. There were zoological and biological collections. At some point, the Egyptian Hall of Balloch became a haven for a travelling museum of antiquities that travelled around Great Britain. So Belzoni left Liverpool and went to London. And this is the year 1819. Belzoni and his main findings are found in London. Then he made a special exhibition in Piccadilly, which was dedicated to his main findings. There, fragments are shown. It is clear that the reproduction of the reliefs by Abu Simbel is about Karnak. And of course, the main theme of this trip to ancient Egypt is the tomb of Seti I and its incredible interiors. This is what the exhibition looked like. The interiors of some rooms of the tomb were recreated. It was illuminated by candles. Here, noble ladies and gentlemen travel around Belzoni's exhibition and look at these images. But it was done in a totally vandalistic way. The thing is that inside the tomb itself, Belzoni and his subordinates take off the castings from the genuine Egyptian reliefs and put a mass of papier-mâché mixed with gypsum on them. Please look at the frame on the left. This is the figure of the god Ptah from one of the rooms of the tomb. We'll see this image again today, and where the castings were taken from the god's face, almost all the pigment, all the polychrome painting was gone. I'll show you a very rare shot that few people have seen. This is one of the castings in Belzoni, which was made with this mass of papier-mâché and gypsum. It's not painted. What you see now is a matrix inside which the genuine Egyptian colour remained. These are fragments of the paint that once covered the profile of the king Seti I, which naturally, due to the fact that it's a wet mass, remained inside this cast. Today, these sad evidence of the fact that a significant part of the paintings of one of the most magnificent tombs in ancient Egypt were lost. Some of these matrices have come to our time and are still actively used today to restore the original pigment in the three-dimensional computer reconstructions of Seti I's tomb that have been made since the early 2000s. In parallel with these reconstructions of the fragments of the room, Belzoni presents a special book that he wrote about the tomb of Seti I. This is a tab in this book. This is a general section of the tomb he found in Belzoni. And if you look closely at the burial chamber at the largest room here, you'll see the objects there. And when Belzoni opened the tomb, there were a lot of genuine objects from Seti I's burial inventory. It's clear that in ancient times the robbers took out everything that was precious, such as gold, azurite, oils, alabaster, but also wooden remains, fragments of burial furniture, fragments of royal coffins, and finally an absolutely stunning one made of travertine, the stone that we often call an alabaster sarcophagus in Egyptology. And the royal sarcophagus was still in its place. And this sarcophagus probably became Belzoni's main acquisition, which he brought from the tomb to the exhibition in Piccadilly. If we look at the chronicles of that time, it was a sensation for London. There's another important element I've already mentioned. Look at the frame in front of you. On the right, there's a small sketch of Belzoni, a rather distorting proportion, but it's an image of one of the tombstones where the king is depicted during the ritual run with the oar. What's in the centre is all that's left of the tombstone. The image hasn't been preserved. These fragments are being reconstructed today thanks to the sketches that Giovanni Battista Belzoni made not only for the publication of his discovery, but also for the famous exhibition in London. Belzoni is no longer an oriental traveller, not a man with a turban on his head, not a man wearing an Arabian robe and smoking a hookah. Now he's a gentleman. Look at the parade portrait that's kept in the British Museum's collection today. Here in the centre there's a gentleman, John Belzoni, not Giovanni anymore, but John Belzoni. That's his name in London. Now he's a wealthy man, popular in society, a well-known traveller. He even becomes a patron in several projects. What's at the bottom is his main acquisition. Here on the right is probably the main sculptural monument that Belzoni brought from the banks of the Nile. He called this monument the Young Memnon. It's the upper part of the Colossus of Ramses the Great from the Armaseum, from his late temple in Thebes. It's an amazing monument made of granite with the inclusion of grey and pink granite. The place where the pink granite was found was chosen to depict the face of Ramses II. This monument, after the exhibition in 1825, was acquired by the British Museum. The second most expensive item from Belzoni's collection is the sarcophagus of Setius I. A rare shot with an aquarium shows how the sarcophagus eventually acquired its current place of storage. The thing is that the price of £2,000, which today is equal to many millions of British pounds, it's clear that the price categories have changed completely. The price of £2,000 was unbearable for the British Museum's Advisory Board in London. At some point, the most expensive item from this exhibition was bought by John Soane, a collector, an enlightener, an art historian, a collector of rarities. Just as this sarcophagus used to be placed on 4 small columns in the basement of the lower part of John Soane's museum in London, it's still there today. Let's take a look at this amazing monument. This is a shot from today. The sarcophagus used to be anthropomorphic. Only the basement is still intact. The cover of the sarcophagus depicting the king in the image of Osiris was badly damaged by robbers. Based on the fragments Belzoni brought to reconstruct it, we can see a traditional Egyptian royal sarcophagus depicting Osiris, a voluminous Osiris set with the goddess protector wrapped around her wings. The beauty of this monument is amazing. It may not be immediately visible from the photo taken in the hall of this museum. But one of the characteristic features of the art of the 1st century was a particular style, not only very high in terms of contour, in terms of images, but also in terms of technology. It was very fashionable and prestigious to make monuments out of travertine, a semi-transparent aluminum sheet, and to encrust it with blue glass. This semi-transparent stone, encrusted with blue deposits, gave a very beautiful, exquisite and graphic picture. A few numbers. So the 1st century sarcophagus, travertine, a glass-like blue pigment. Length 284 dine, width and shoulders 111.8 centimeters. Height at the highest point 81.3 centimeters. Belzoni was not impressed. Unfortunately, the border of the sarcophagus has a signature of Giovanni Belzoni. It is surprising that it was not stopped by the fact that the entire sarcophagus is covered with absolutely stunning images. We will see them now. I would like to thank my friend, a wonderful Orientalist and playwright, Natalia Vaiko, who, as a present for today's lecture in London, made these incredible shots. This is what is depicted inside the bottom of the sarcophagus. This is the body of the goddess nude, with an incredible face. She is depicted in an archaic wig in a goddess's dress. Her name is inscribed with hieroglyphic signs above her head. She literally steps out of this mass of translucent stone in order to accept the mummy of Seti in her arms, for he is in a post-mortem state of Osiris, and nude is the mother of Osiris. That is, she, inside this sarcophagus, brings Osiris and Seti together again, inside her not just maternal arms, but inside her womb. If there's a huge goddess nude at the bottom of the sarcophagus, then the contour of the sarcophagus is covered with images and vignettes of the famous Egyptian late text of the Book of Wrath. We will talk a lot about it today when we go down to the depths of the royal tomb. And the Book of Wrath tells about a one-way journey of the sunboat. This journey is divided into 12 hours of the night. Each hour of the night is associated with a certain region of the new world, the Duat, as the ancient Egyptians called it. So, diving into the new region of the Duat, in front of the royal boat, the satellites of the sun, Lavon, themselves open the great gates, which are guarded by fire snakes, spirits, protectors. This story of the great gates, which is divided into 12 hours of the night, becomes the main theme for those artists who made the decoration of this wonderful travertine sarcophagus of Seti. Let's look at its contour. You can see here how the clock of the Book of Wrath, the clock of the night, is depicted on the sarcophagus. I'm interested in the fact that the first hour begins in the legs, because it sets the sequence of these images, not the beauty, but the logic. If we imagine the mummy of the king of Seti, the form which opened its eyes, it looks at the foot of its own sarcophagus. Thus, K, the life force, or the king's double, when he's inside the mummy, can read the text that covers the sarcophagus following the beginning of this story, which starts from the foot. Unfortunately, the tomb, as we understand it, was flooded with water, and it was quite hard to bring the sarcophagus to London, so most of these blue incrustations were not preserved. But we can imagine, we can understand that when these incrustations were there, the image was read very easily. It was not just embossed, it was almost painted with this blue glass mass. The task of the final image, which is at the top of the head, is to give the consciousness of the deceased king the knowledge that life is endless, that life is immortal. Therefore, at the first hour of the night, the sun only goes down to another world, to the other side of the sky, to the incredible cosmic abysses. And in the final part, which is behind the king's head, there is the rise of the sun. This is a sign that, like at sunrise, the sun rises every day. Also, Seti, passing through the transformation of the night, through the transformation of death and the dangers of the other world. He will definitely be reborn. We remember with you that travertine is a translucent stone, so the work is incredible. Let's look at a fragment. Here is the solar boat. It floats on the water of the other world. The sun is depicted here in the form of a disc, inside of which there is a scorpion. This is the morning sun. The snake that wriggling frames the sun is Meccan. This is the great snake of time. Next, as satellites of the sun on the boat of millions of years, the first figure on the nose is Sia. This is the pre-eternal wisdom. And the closing figure, which stands near the steering axle, is Heko. This is the god of charm, the god of magic, the god of power of the word. Here the wisdom and the pre-eternal charm are the satellite of the sun god when it transcends one of the hours of the night between their gates. In order for you to see how these images look in general, to see how this decoration looks, I specifically show you the old drawings. The frame in the left part is the first part of the Book of Gates, when the gates of another world open at the great posts, with the heads of Ovna and the heads of heavenly Chocolates. This is not yet Duat. This is the space of the west, the space of Manet. This is the zone where the transition between the world of the living and the world of the eternally alive begins. And this is where the sunboat rushes. You have just seen this fragment. Next, one of the hours of the Book of Gates. This is the 8th hour. And you see that the book is divided into 3 registers. In the central register, everything that is related to the sunboat. And here, Sviradukov drags this boat through the space of another world. At the top, usually in the upper row, something related to the good events of this hour. There are either the righteous dead or spirits or satellites or gods who support the sunboat. In the lower row, something related to punishments is most often depicted. Here you see the punished opponents of the sun god who are connected, who turned to the fiery lakes of the gods so that they could not stop the movement of the sun and thus could not stop the cycle of the existence of the sun within the universe. 2 more drawings. This is the 11th hour of the night in the Book of Gates on the left. Look at the number of absolutely incredible creatures here. Here are the gods who have 4 cobras instead of heads, the most diverse creatures. We will look at such things today in the royal tomb itself. And finally, the final scene. This is the finale of the Book of Gates. Here it is, the sunrise, when Nu, the great god of chaos, the great father of all gods, rises from the space abyss, the water abyss, millions of years ago. Here on this abyss are the gods and the sun itself in the form of a scorpion and a solar disk. Finally, just above the solar disk, there is a small black figure. This is the goddess Nu, the goddess of the sky, and she in turn stands on the head of a creature that has turned in a circle. This creature that has turned in a circle is Osiris, who in his form covers the round Duat, the round world of Nu. Thus the sunrise depends on the good and correct passage of the secrets of the night. Now I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the travertine is a translucent stone. I will show you a frame that was given to me by some friends from the British Museum. This is what the sarcophagus with a backlight looks like. This is the very final scene that is next to you in the drawing. Take a look at it, please. Here are the waters, the eternal Inun with his arms outstretched, the million-year-old boat, the sun, and the goddess Nu standing on the head of her immortal son Osiris in the structure of the travertine. Here, by the way, you can see the incrustation with this blue glass quite well. That is, at the moment when there is a source of light, It turns from the apparent white into such an incredible likeness of the morning dawn. All this, of course, had the most direct connotations with the symbolic series of the late ancient Egyptian art. All this spoke of eternal life and immortality. It was in this sarcophagus that the mummy of Seti I was once located, probably one of the most preserved mummies of the Egyptian rulers that we know today. I specifically show not a modern frame, but a frame taken at the end of the 19th century, exactly when the mummy was found. In this state, it was found in someone else's sarcophagus in the famous hiding place for royal mummies, the so-called hiding place number 320 in Deir el-Bahri, a little further south from the famous rock temple of the Pharaoh's wife Hatshepsut, the famous temple of the GSR. In 1871, the locals, the famous family of tomb robbers by the name of Abdel Rasul, were looking for new graves. And it was then that the Rasul brothers found the famous detective story that I will not go into today in detail. So they found an underground hiding place where there were 37 mummies, kings and queens, princes and princesses. By the way, the first one was himself and his son Ramses the Great. The flow of things related to the faces of the first greatness with the great rulers who were in Europe forced the French leadership of the Egyptian Antiquities Service to conduct an investigation. As a result, not only the culprits involved in this illegal trade, but also the Tsarist mummies said goodbye to the rulers for the last time, the inhabitants of the famous village of Korna. The men were shooting in the air according to the Arab custom, and the women were crying and sprinkling ash on their faces. They said goodbye not only to the mummies, and not only to the possibility to sell some eternal souvenir to the Europeans, but they also said goodbye to those who once were the rulers of their land. Here are a few shots. Ahmed Abdel Rasul, one of the two brothers who found the rock cache directly at the entrance to this tomb. It is also called the Height of Kai in ancient Egyptian because it was located on a very high ledge. This is what this place looks like today, and it was explored not so long ago by the German archaeological mission led by Erhard Graf. An exact plan was made, by the way, by the Russian architect Nadezhda Reshetnikova, a very good specialist. The whole story about the finding of the royal mummies, among which was Seti, was clarified. New interesting facts were obtained. It's also curious that for the first time since the 19th century, the Europeans saw this corridor. Here it is on the screen, where the kings and queens once rested, not in their own, but in someone else's sarcophagi, which were poor. Such wooden sarcophagi, like the one on the left, contain the great royal remains. This sarcophagus, the one that Seti I was found in, is older than Seti. Look at the luxuriously encrusted Phaean eyes with obsidian and limestone. Anyway, on these coffins in which the royal mummies were transferred from one coffin to another, a part of the story is preserved. Think about it. We know, for example, that the mummy of Seti I was reburied 4 times. The original tomb was discovered, and the tomb of Seti I also served as a coffin for other royal mummies for several decades. In particular, it was there that his son, or Ramses II, was buried. All this happened in the 10th century BC, when there was turmoil in the Fives, when Egypt was going through the most difficult period of the third transition, and when the guards of the Tsar's Valley could not cope with the robbers, the Vandals, among whom, by the way, were the same residents of the 5 necropolis. In particular, when the royal mummies were initially taken from their tombs and reburied in the temple of Ramses III Medine Abu, which at that time was the centre of the 5 necropolis, the reburied ones were freed from unnecessary gold jewellery, gold masks, up to the point that the real gold-plated sarcophagus was stripped of the wood in order to melt it later and get a small piece of gold that was once part of an amazing work of art. It is curious that at some point the temple of the goddess Mut in Karnak, the oracle of the goddess Mut, gave an order for the transfer, the new transfer, the last transfer of the royal mummies. And then part of the royal remains turned out to be in that very rocky cache not far from Deir el-Bahri, which was originally made as a tomb of the Queen Inhapi, K. Inhapi. This is how the text calls her. Here's a fragment of the text on the sarcophagus of Seti I, year 10, the 4th month of the season of the ascension of King Seaman, the day of the ascension of King Minmatra Seti. Yes, he will be alive, flourishing from this tomb, so that he could be taken to the high place of Inhapi, which is a great place, made a priest of Amun-Ara, king of the gods, son of Baki, and the father of God, Amun-Ara, king of the gods, the third priest of Khonsu in the house of Amun-Ara, the king of the gods, the priest of Seim. Seim is the title of the priest of the late cult in the temple of Sirmatra Sitapenra in the house of Amon, that is in Ramesseum, the priest and chief distributor of Nespakashoti, the son of Baki Khonsu. It was made after Mut, who in whose power the great place said, "What is well preserved in my care, there will be no damage to it in the transfer from the tomb to which they were, to take them to this high place of Inhapi, which is a great place where Amenhotep resides." This last phrase, the element of this text, where Amenhotep resides, is very important to us because, as you understand, this is a rock cache. There is no necessary magic mechanism that would cover the walls with paintings, reliefs that would contain necessary magic objects. In order to illuminate this cave carved in the rock, the remains of Amenhotep I and the godly king, and the remains of his mother, the famous queen Yahmes Nefertari, he and she for 400 years were revered in Thebes as godly, as saints and protectors of the Theban necropolis, as protectors of all the dead. In the end, they first transferred Amenhotep, his mother, and then to the place where Amenhotep resides, to the most famous remains of the godly king, they placed other royal mummies, including Seti I. So Elida, let me remind you, it was not until 1871 when the local residents of the Abd al-Rasul family, and then in 1881 when the tomb was officially opened by the representatives of the Antiquities Service and the archaeologist Emil Brugsch was found here, the mummy was removed. For a long time it was kept in the Bulaq Museum, which was the predecessor of the Cairo Museum, then the Egyptian Museum on the Tahrir Square, which we all know and love. Today the mummy of Seti I is kept in a magnificent underground mausoleum on the base floor of Al-Hadar, the Egyptian Civilization Museum in Fustat, in the southern suburb of Cairo, where a grand mausoleum for the royal mummies. Let's go back to Tasatat, the great place, to the Valley of the Kings. Now, the central part of the footage is made from the rock. I think those who know the Valley of the Kings well immediately recognize the place. Right under the rock from which the image was taken is the tomb of Tutankhamun, and this lower fence belongs to it. Further opposite, there is a small rest area, and in the side entrance, the so-called southern entrance. The blue arrow points to one of the almost unnoticeable tombs. This is the 17th tomb of the Valley of the Kings, which was made for Seti I. In the Arab era, due to the fact that the entrances to the tombs were decorated, the Arabs called this place in the memoirs of Belzoni. This name already sounded the Gates of the Kings or the Gates of the Kings. Let's see what this legendary tomb looks like. I remind those who want to make a trip a special ticket for the tomb of Seti I. It never entered and does not enter among the 3 tombs that can usually be seen on the Bere in the Valley of the Kings. You can immediately think about your finances and your wishes. Believe me, you will not say thank you later. The fact that the tomb of Seti I can now be seen is unique. For many decades it was closed for tourists for the sake of safety. I remember how in the late 90s, for the first time, I was in the tomb of Seti, spending a lot of time in the Ministry of Heritage in Cairo to get this permission. Now you can just buy a ticket, let it be expensive, and be in this amazing space. So let's go down to the great monastery of the King of Minmatra and look at all these amazing evidence of the search for immortality, which the best masters of their time left on its walls. Before we find ourselves in the dungeon, let's take a look at the axonometry of the tomb. The tomb is huge. Not only is it very large, but there is also a so-called secret passage into the abyss, which makes this tomb the longest in the Valley of Kings. Before we go inside, I want you to understand the logic of this tomb, and for this I will use such coloured squares. So the blue arrow points to the entrance. You go down the first staircase. The first corridor opens in front of you, in which, as in almost all other rooms of the tomb, there's a huge number of painted reliefs. There begins the journey of the sun to another world, and the king becomes Shem Sura. He becomes a companion of the sun, his follower, and the sun invites him to follow him on this journey. The first text, which at this time always opened the entrance to the royal tomb, is the so-called flying of Ra. This is the glorification of Ra in its 75 names. Then the second staircase, and then the separate hours from the famous book Imiduat or Amduat begin. What is in the afterlife is the basic book of the New Kingdom. This is what is not available to private people, with a rare exception. This book divides the space of the night into 12 hours and tells about the path that awaits the king in another world. The main goal of this path is, of course, to attain immortality. In the end, having seen all the secrets of the night, Setia becomes a companion of the sun god and reunites with him on his solar planet, thereby becoming one of the good, justified kings who are equal to Osiris, who are related to Osiris in another world. It is very important to note the following detail. In earlier tombs, for example, Amduat, all 12 hours were given in direct sequence from the first hour to the 12th. In the tombs of Setia Vaishnavite, everything is different. The hours of different texts, fragments of different texts are broken up in such a way that, in fact, the most sacred, the most significant elements of these texts for immortality are transferred to the place where the burial chamber is located. On the contrary, the hours associated with the journey of the king through another world are transferred to the beginning of the tomb. Therefore, the 4th and 5th hours of Amduat are in the square highlighted by the turquoise rectangle. It is no coincidence that the vertical image of the orange rectangle is a mine. You will see now that the upper part of this mine is richly decorated with images of the gods and the presence of the king before the gods. Nevertheless, this mine, first of all, the task of this mine is to catch the water, the very water that will flow if the rain is too strong, and the entrance to the tomb will be open. Therefore, this mine protects the rest of the tomb from the possible water flow from the robbers as well. Next, the zone, which is limited by the red rectangle, the first hall with pillars. Here is the image of the king before Osiris. Here are the scenes from the well-known Book of Wrath. Separate hours of the Book of Wrath after Amduat, sometimes even in a mix, will appear here in this tomb, having a very clear symbolism, which we will talk about soon. Further, in the same zone, there is a side chamber, and this chamber was not completed. Setius left for another world, We do not know the reason of his death, but he died a young man, and the tomb was not completed. And this chamber where we are today, this chamber on its walls and pillars, preserves sketches of the project, which later should have turned into this magnificent, voluminous relief. Therefore, this chamber is very valuable for the history of ancient Egyptian art. We return to the hall with 4 pillars. From here, the side staircase, the secret staircase, goes down further, and we get to the zone which is limited by a green rectangle. Here are the lower corridors, and on the walls of these corridors there is a famous ceremony of opening the mouth and eyes, one of the most important elements of the Egyptian burial ritual at the door. And here is the yellow zone. It is not accidentally yellow, because in ancient times this room was called the House of Gold. Pernebu. Gold here was associated not only with royalty, but also with immortality. This is the divine flesh. This is actually a huge burial chamber, which is joined by side rooms, each of which has its own purpose and its own rich department. Already from the burial chamber, the purple arrow down is the very secret corridor to the story about which we will come to at the very end of our journey. So, the flying of Hera. The first text and the first theme for the image is the journey of the sun through another world. And the main illustration of the flying of Hera is now in front of you. This is a triangular shape of the sun. You see the sun at noon in the form of a disc. You see the sacred scorpion Hipparei. This is the morning sun. And you see Euphra, the night sun in the form of a deity which has the head of Ophnus. The fact is that the night sun is perceived in the Egyptian texts of the era of Hermesids as Ba, as a soul, as an active entity of the god of the pre-eternal. On the consonants of the word Ba and the Egyptian name Ophnus is built this symbolic row where the night sun with the head of Ophnus has nothing to do with Amun or with Khnum or with Banabjadet or with all the other Ophnus-headed deities of Egypt. This is Euphra, literally the flesh of the sun, and it is in this form that the sun god will appear in most of the images that accompany the books about the afterlife, as if in a row of movements of stairs, corridors, the sun disk is sinking, rolling into another world. Nevertheless, we know that we are not talking about the undergrounds, but about the outer parts of this world that the Egyptians located on the other side of the sky. Since ancient times, the idea that the passages to this other side of the world are located on the northern part of the sky, where the constellation of the Great Bear is located. The king, entering his tomb, greets the sun. So, the first corridor, we will now see in detail all the main images that need to be known here. On the left side, the input group of images and the beginning of the world's flight. On the right side, the continuation of the world's flight. On both walls, the sun god has 75 names. Each of the 75 names embodies one of the functions of this deity. In the movement of the sun god, on the movement of the sun god, an Egyptian idea about the time of infinity is built, about the time of Nehek. In the creation, which was made by Demiurge, the sun god, in the creation of the universe, the final of this creation, when the creation ends, when the world returns to its original times, to the state of Nun, the eternal ocean, and Hek, the god of infinity, the world will be reborn and created anew. The king himself enters his tomb to pay homage to the sun. And here Seti appears so amazingly young in a long, very fashionable wig. This is the most fashionable wig of his time. Unfortunately, there is no colour, one of the prints of Belzoni, but once it was all very colourful. Here you see the king standing in the left frame in front of the god Raharakti, or Raharakti, Rahor of 2 horizons, and the king is depicted in the expression pose. His right hand is stretched to the sun god in such a gesture that all the texts that are depicted behind him he reads. He turns to the sun, to the Proverbs, glorifying 75 forms of the sun. He says that he knows the secret names of the sun, and since Ra, as you remember, is revered as Ba, the eternal god in Egypt, then the King Seti becomes the one who's very close to understanding the highest secrets of the world. He glorifies the sun, he repeats its names, and thus he wants to get the support of the sun, so that Ra-Harakti takes him to his solar ship, and together with the ship of the sun, Seti must then start his journey across the boundless regions of the world. And in each of these regions, he will not only see the incredible, in each of these regions he begins to become one or another deity in order to eventually gain the very strength of immortality that will make him a co-dimensional god, spirit, and blessed ancestor. If the first scene of Ra's flight is always the prophecy of the king to the sun god, then the next scene is the beginning of the immersion, the beginning of the collision of the sun with a mysterious other world. And here is the sign that we have already seen, a protective snake on top, and below this movement into the abyss is conveyed by two absolutely wonderful symbols. A crocodile that dives into this world, into the world of the original gods, and due to the fact that darkness reigns there, and sometimes the darkness of this world is so strong that it is very difficult for the sun god himself to illuminate at least those spaces that are next to him. Then next to him appears, look at what a wonderful image, the cow Nagao. She has a torch between her horns, and this cow Nagao, the sun cow, she with her torch, standing right in front of the crocodile, being immersed in the mysterious area of the other world, she begins to illuminate magically those areas where the sun god descends. You know, my friends, today, in addition to large images and panoramas, there will be a lot of details. Please look at the crocodile, at the eyes, at the jaws, at the teeth, at how his paws are made, at the skin on his stomach. Look at the absolutely incredible animalistic of both the crocodile and the cow Nagao. When we look at the reliefs from the tomb of Seti I, every element, every detail will be made with such perfection, with incredible elaboration. And then, following the crocodile, the cow Nagao and the sun god, as if repeating the path of the soul of Zar Seti, we move deeper into his tomb and in fact into the mysterious areas of the other world. The ceiling of these corridors is richly painted. It is badly damaged because please remember the notes of Belzoni. The corridor was covered with soil and he had to squeeze in the space that remained between the soil and the ceiling. All these losses of painting on the ceiling are the backs of the Europeans who dug here in order to penetrate inside this tomb. Initially, the dark blue, the azure blue ceiling adorned the image of the great griffins. This is the goddess Nebet, patroness of Upper Egypt. She has a large crown of F on her head. In her hand she holds the sacred Apakalahu, which she transmits the Chao Enang, the breath of eternal life, the essence of the Tsar. Please note that due to the fact that all this is associated with the cult of the sun, in addition to the Apakala itself, she also squeezes the sign of Shen, a circular hieroglyph which transmits in the Egyptian symbol of infinity, the eternal circle of rotation of the sun in its orbit. It is important to note one more detail. Here these griffins, they fly like registers in the night sky between the stars, and above their wings there are fragments of hieroglyphic texts that mention the Tsar's title, i.e. the throne name of Minmatra and the personal name of the Tsar Seti and the necessary epithets. And then we see a completely amazing dilemma, because the Tsar was called Seti and most likely even Sethi, the one who belongs to Sethi. Sethi is the primordial enemy of Osiris, and therefore in the tomb where the Tsar becomes Osiris, Seti cannot be depicted. If we talk about other monuments of Seti I, for example, the hypostyle of the Karnak temple, there, please, the name is spelled completely correctly. There is the sign of the god Seti in his name. In the tomb, in the world where there is no place for Seti, the god of change, transformation, disorder and storm, in the name of Seti, please look at the blue arrow in his name. The sign of Seti is marked with the sign of Osiris, or in some cases with the sign of Asidatet, that is, different images or symbols of the Osiris circle replace in the name of the Tsar the sign that could not be, for many reasons, depicted inside his tomb. Here it is written Seti Nerinta, Seti, beloved by the god Ptah, the personal name of the Tsar, and the epithet Nerinta, which often accompanies the name of the Tsar in his inscriptions. Let's move on. In this corridor, which is now in front of us where we are, the turquoise arrow shows a very interesting image on the left. This is a continuation, and this is an illustration of the curse of Nimrah. This is an image of different forms that the sun god saw during his journey. These images are very different. The thing is that Ra is a very high deity, and Ra is very close to the eternal God, and in turn Ra can fall apart on many gods, some of whom we know, among them many gods of the Osiris or the sun circle, but it can also fall apart on spirits. At the same time, we will see this image again. Above the passage there, a huge figure of the goddess, Maat. She is the ruler of the West here. She is the ruler of the Holy Land, that is, she is the ruler of Necropolis, because it is from Maat, from the goddess of truth, peace, order, lawfulness, and justice, that the main task in this tomb will happen. Will it be identified with the name of Maat, with Osiris? Will it become Osiris, and accordingly will it gain immortality? The image is very beautiful. I will show you a fragment of absolutely amazing images that illustrate the flight of Ra. Here, of course, is an absolutely incredible fantasy, an incredible enlightenment of the Egyptian masters. By the way, here's a cat with a great cry. This is Urmiu, this is a great cat. On the far right, in the image of which sometimes the sun comes next to Osiris, the god of another world, whose strand of hair fell on his face, and so on. All these gods are signed. We are now approaching the figure of the goddess Maat, and I will show one more element of the flight of Ra. But first, also note that on both sides the figure of the goddess Maat, despite the loss of colour. Imagine what an amazing painting. They are flanked by images of personal names, and here the name of Minmatra, the throne name of Seti, which is translated as Ra, strengthened by the truth, is not just installed on the sign of immortality in gold, but is accompanied by the title Osiris, the king. That is, the king who's already become Osiris, the king who has already been reborn. This is such a magical message. So Osiris, the king of Minmatra, and the next oval of Cartouche, with the name Son of Ra, Son of the Sun, Seti, and again on behalf of Seti, the figure of Osiris, and not of the deity in honour of which Seti was named. Now the arrow shows us the element of Ra's flight, and here are the most incredible spirits, and in fact, I will repeat myself, the forms of the sun god on which he can fall apart. Here is Pavian and the New World, the infinite, the second, the third figure, the Lord of forces, and the last figure, the Lord of horror, the Lord of fear. That is the most different figures that represent the different forms of the sun god. We move on, and again the arrow points us to the fact that in fact the scenes below, which seem not to be full images, in fact the images there, just these walls of the tomb, were not completed. Let's look at what meets the king and the sun when we go deeper and deeper we plunge into the tomb. On the right wall here is such a delightful Anubis. It is the first of the divine canopy. The divine canopy is the place in front of the tomb where, as you remember, the final stages of preparation for the ritual preparation for the burial took place. Here are only sketches of the artist. Here, initially, the drawing was made in red. The red colour can be seen somewhere. This is just a sketch. Then in red, the older artist of Necropolis makes this perfect black outline on which the relief will be made. We know from the documents in the royal tomb that two teams of masters, one team of the right wall, another team of the left wall, that is, two teams made each their own wall, and at first the tomb was completely cut out to its end, and then the finishing began from the inside of the burial chamber. At that moment, when the reliefs were already painted, the preparation for these first galleries had just begun. That is why here in the first galleries there are such elaborate unfinished elements. But again, this did not play a role for the burial ritual, because in fact the image of the deity is here. The traditional canon, when Anubis meets the king, or for example the king's tomb, has two sites, that is, two Anubis sitting on pedestals, and these pedestals represent the gates of the world. And under each of the pedestals is a kneeling figure of the goddess Isis or the goddess Nephthys. Here, under this Anubis, is the figure of the goddess Nephthys. Look how interesting it is. Here, the master's already begun to carve the image. Here, the graphic drawing of black and red with carved hieroglyphic signs. Here, the corridor is quite narrow. Unfortunately, these terrible railings, therefore it's impossible to take a good photo. The goddess is kneeling. She's kneeling on the sign of gold and the sign of immortality. And in her hands, she holds the Shen, this infinity, as if rolling it. If the goddess Nephthys is on the right wall, then accordingly we should expect Isis on the left wall. She is incredibly beautiful. You know, there are some things that are inaccessible to my understanding because passing people touch her face. This black thing on her face is a trace of human hands. Even after the tomb was restored, it was restored in the late 90s, and when it was opened for tourists, and then on the internet, people are surprised how bad the Egyptians are that they closed Toland's tomb again for visitors. Unfortunately, this is the only way to save the tomb from modern vandals who don't understand that you can't touch such works. But despite the black spot on her face, look at the face. Just like in the late temple of Seti I in Abydos, unfinished images sometimes show us the work of a sculptor better than the images that are painted, where the sculptural form is covered with pigment. The volume of the wig is a bandage, a funeral bandage. The sad face, the lips, the nose, everything up to these hieroglyphic signs. This inscription speaks of the words with which Isis addresses the deceased king. All this, of course, shows the incredible exquisiteness of the Egyptian artist. But you have to agree that the signs are not static. There may be some distortions, not everything is symmetrical. In any case, you can feel the living hand of the living Egyptian artist who created this wonderful image of the goddess. Due to the fact that there is not much backlighting, you can lose another very important element. In the lower part of this sculpture, there are two more royal names. The king is the main one in this tomb. Here is Cartouche. The oval with the names is decorated with such solar symbols in the form of a solar disc and stylized ostrich feathers. These ostrich feathers are painted red, black and green. These are the colours of the Nile's leash when the Nile changed its colour. These are the symbols of the revival. There are two names, and these two names on both sides hold the two figures of the goddess Maat, Maat of our world, and Maat of the world of others. Maat is the daughter of the ruler of the sky. It is written here that she not only protects with her spread wings, but also the name of the king Seti, the sign of Ankh, the sign of eternal life, as such a magical promise that his death will be safe. We go down the staircase and look at this corridor. We realise that here the main role is played by the sun, the flying of Ra, the treaty between the king and the sun on the right entrance to another world. The next corridor is waiting for us. Unfortunately, this corridor was badly damaged, but its symbolism can be said a lot. The turquoise arrow points to the left wall. Here, in fact, both on the left and on the right wall are fragments illustrated by the text of Amduat, the book about the afterlife, which in ancient Egypt, Amduat is the name adopted in Egyptology. In ancient Egypt, it was called the Book of Eternal Rest. And on the left wall is the 5th hour, on the right wall is the 4th hour, and we understand that we are in a descending corridor. So in the book of Amduat, the 4th and 5th hour of the night is the mysterious kingdom of Socrates, a god who is associated with the passage through the state of death. And then, as the text says, at this moment an impenetrable darkness begins, and the great stream of Uranus, on which the sun's boat at 1 o'clock at night, it cuts off, and in this desert kingdom rivers begin, which consist of liquid flaming fire. And then the descending channels of the underground rivers are also divided into regions. These regions are opened by the doors that are here. Everything is filled with the world of spirits. So in this secret, the deepest part of the other world, the sun meets the great divine egg. The great divine egg is inside the hill. This is the hill of Socrates. And the god Ra touches the ear of this hill in order to hear how the living heart of Socrates in the depth of the night darkness. And this is necessary because in the central part of the night, Ra as a soul, Ra as the Ba of the pre-eternal God, and Socrates as the body of the pre-eternal God do not unite. And from this reconnection of the pre-eternal God as the source of the great life depends the next day cycle. Let's look at the fragments of a very badly damaged wall. This is the divine egg. There is a snake that protects Socrates. Next to it are the signs of life and magical protection, and this secretive egg inside the hill lies on such a sphinx that does not have the back part of the body. It has only parallel symmetrical protomes, that is, the front parts of the lion's body are decorated with heads. This is Aker, the god of the mystery of the earth, and accordingly it is Aker and Isida that are kept in the depth of this night space at 4 o'clock at night. This is the great egg that on the one hand is in a state of death, but the egg is alive. In ancient Egypt, it is very important to understand that death is finite and life has no end. And in a state of death, life kind of freezes, falls asleep for a while in order to wake up again later. And here is the next scene. This is the triumphant Saqqara Osiris as he flies up to get his new wings. He is as if awakened by the sun god, who together with his saint fills this place with golden light. And here the role of the golden background in the tomb of Seti will play a very important role. Nearby in this secluded kingdom of Saqqara Osiris, we move to the right wall, which is more preserved. Here you can see a stream filled with liquid fire, and here is Nabanka, a snake, or Nahip cow, which is associated with feeding. It is depicted here with 3 heads and wings. It walks on human legs. Next to it are cobras and other snakes which fill this space. Nevertheless, the text comments that all these creatures carry life. In the upper right corner there is a huge sun cobra, and next to it is written Ankit, a living creature carrying life. In the lower part, despite the damage, you can see the great lunar eye of Saqqara Osiris, which is held in the hands of Hor and Thoth. This eye is the key to immortality. It is a great symbol of immortality in the Egyptian civilization. This eye is restored. It is a symbolic expression that says that the body is prepared to be transformed so that the entity, and we know that the human entity is very difficult to perceive in ancient Egypt, so that the entity of the deceased king was able to move along the other hours of the night. Here's another fragment that continues. You see here the section of this area on the clock, on the golden stream. You see the door, on the door its name, and even the sun cobra itself, the far right part of this frame. In order to move in the space where all the water's dried up, it moves along the sands and turns into a golden snake, and the stream itself, like a huge golden snake, moves along this scorched space into the abyss of the next hours of the night. And together with the sun god, this is all seen by the entity of the king Seti, before whom great secrets from the huge world begin to open, knowing which he must gain immortality. We pass through this corridor, and I urge you not to hurry, because there is a mine in front of us, and the turquoise arrow points down, because according to the logic, the robbers should stay there. Alas, they did not. But anyway, this mine saved the tomb from drowning. And further, if the lower part of the mine is simply carved out of the rock and not decorated in any way, then the upper part of this room is a house of beauties. And on the one hand, Seti stands here for the first time in front of another world, in front of the hidden world, in front of the gods who act as his protectors. On the other hand, there are echoes of this name, Sperunifer, with the room where the mummy was carved and the body was finished, in which the decomposition was stopped. That is all. There is no further death of the road. It remains in the mine. And then the most difficult process of transformation of the royal entity and the meeting of the king with the world of the gods begins. This is what the mine looks like. It is deep. I unfortunately do not remember how many meters, but there are significantly 6 meters there. And here are the walls above the mine. The background here is pale blue, grey blue. This is the colour of the gods, the colour of the divine world, the colour of the sky. And here Seti stands in front of the goddess Isida, and there is a choir behind him, his patron, his heavenly form, which holds its earthly embodiment by the shoulder and by the hand, as a native brother or as a close family member. And here he is not just Seti Merneptah in the sun, he is Maheru. He is the right voice before Osiris, the ruler of Abydos. And here, of course, I think the masters of Seti, especially with pleasure, although they did not have enough space, apparently they depicted the name of the city of Abydos, knowing how many amazing monuments Abydos built Seti. This is the left scene, the right scene. Seti brings vessels of wine to the goddess Hathor Iminted. Hathor is the first thing that Phila, the heavenly lady, the ruler of all the gods, the ruler of the earth, sacred Western. Hathor Iminted, Hathor of the West, and Iminted as Western, was considered in the necropolis one of the most favourable goddesses, who acts as a great defender of any deceased, not only the king, before the passions and horrors of the other world. Here is the ceiling. Here is the starry sky. Ancient Egyptians considered these stars, or as they called them, shining beings, divine blessed ancestors. That is, here are not just stars, here are blessed ancestors to whom Seti must join after completing all stages of his transformation. When we pass through the hall of the mine, the first hall with 4 pillars opens. This is an amazing room of the tomb. Here, of course, the scenes of the king's abode before the various gods. All these gods are his defenders, his heavenly protectors. Here, on the far left pillar, which is well preserved, the king stands before the god Ptah, who acts here not only as a defender of the king, but also as the creator of his immortal form. Because Ptah is the protector of art, crafts, and accordingly, all those beautiful burial objects, the same alabaster sarcophagus, they are, from the Egyptian point of view, created by masters inspired by the talent and secret art of the god Ptah. Ptah is depicted standing on a special pedestal in the form of the hieroglyph of the goddess Mat. He is Hetifer Mat, pacified by the truth, and he, as you can see, stretches to the king's nostrils the symbols of life, power, and indomitability. In fact, each of these pillars is an absolute work of art. We will, of course, look at the walls of this room, but in fact it is important for me to draw your attention to the following. Here in this hall, the main axis of the tomb ends. It ends with the room where the reliefs were not completed to the end, where there are only sketches of future images. In fact, the tomb continues on the left, and there is a staircase. This is the place that was closed in another attempt, in another hope to save the royal tomb from the Vandals, from the robbers. Unfortunately, the current problem of the very large tomb of Seti I is the terrible lighting that is made there. Here is such a luminescent lighting from below. As a result, it incredibly distorts these relief images, making them, if not ugly, then strange. Today, during the lecture, I asked my foreign colleagues to provide me with material from the archives. I will show you how these same images look, not today. In this case, this is my frame made a couple of years ago, but in the 1950s, when there was no such lighting. And you will see what a masterpiece it really is, and how the current lighting prevents us from perceiving the true artistic level of those reliefs made by the Seti masters. Now we have turned to the exit. We came from there. On the left is the goddess Nade, the great mother of Sais, one of the creators of the world, according to the ideas of the ancient Egyptians, the great goddess Androgyne, the goddess Voitelnitsa, the lady of quality, the protector of all the dead, the great mother of God. On the far post, on the right, there is the goddess Selkit, with her scorpion on her head. Further on, there's Anubis, and there you can see Isis. Here, in general, the king is greeted by the gods of the Assyrian circle, because we remember that Isis, Nephthys, Nide, and Selkit are the four great protectors of the dead, the patroness of the sides of the world, the patroness of the sarcophagus, the canopy in general, this inner sacred geography of this tomb. Well, in addition to this Anubis, Osiris, Ptah, Atum, other gods associated with the protection of the king in a different world. Two pillars. Here's Nade in front of you, and look at what a beautiful pillar. On the right, here, very gently, like this, under the elbow, behind the shoulder, like a native, like a beloved, the king is greeted by the goddess Nephthys, whose role in the ritual of embalming, in the ritual of transition through death, in every possible way, was emphasized by the Egyptians from ancient times, from the 3rd millennium BC to the new era, from the era of the great texts of the pyramids. Two more pillars, or rather two more planes of these four pillars. On the left, a very beautiful scene. The king is met again at the threshold of the secret areas of another world. Hathor and Mentheth, the Western queen, this 9-headed queen of the gods, says the text about her. She gives the king all magical protection, all life, all immortality, all power, and all health. Here, health is a very important thing for the king, because it's all connected with the understanding of the restoration during the embalming of the integrity of his body, which was violated by death. On the right, the choir of Sennacherib and Isis, the choir of Set, which is again the heavenly prototype, the function of which the king performed during his earthly reign. The main big scene of this room, we have already touched on it when I told you about Belzoni, is the meeting of the king with his heavenly ancestors. There is a huge naos inside, which is filled with golden light. In the centre there is the king, in front of him is Osiris, behind Osiris there is Hathor and Menthith, and behind the king, holding him by the shoulder, there is the choir, his heavenly prototype. And here, there is one very interesting mystery and very pleasant for many people information. The thing is that this part of the white coating, which is on these reliefs, is not a faded colour, and this is the remaining gypsum liquid from the matrix which Belzoni and his subordinates were using to make the prints. And there is still a lot that can be saved. Look carefully at this frame. Do you see what is in the white frame? This is a cleaning. In fact, this is a cleaning made in the mid-2000s. This coating is removed from this part, sorry for the word, made by the matrix in Belzoni. In fact, the colour is much better than we think. And when the Egyptian government finds the necessary funds and makes this project, many elements can be restored and the tomb will look completely different. Because such cleaning was made in many rooms of the tomb, they show that the colour has been preserved very well, and all this white coating, all this coating of times can be removed. The tomb will be much more perfect than it seems to many today. We will look at the walls of this room, and we have here illustrations for the book Wrath. And here I show you in the corner of the Book of the Gate at 5 o'clock the great doors of another world. All of them are guarded by cobras that spit out liquid fire. There are names on the doors. Next to the doors is a great guardian in the image of a snake, and each of these snakes has its own name, and the satellites of the sun pronounce these names, secret spells, so that the gates of another world open at this hour. There are 3 registers in front of us. Remember, we have already seen such 3 registers in the set of the sarcophagus, and here in the central register is the sunbed, and the gods pull this sunbed in the lower part, what concerns the world of man, and in the upper part, the blessed spirits. And here is a very important detail of this tomb, which has been reproduced many times since the 19th century. In the lower register, which opens with the figure of Korah, there are images of different nations inhabiting the land. First there are 4 red Egyptians, then 4 with yellowish skin. These are Syrians. The red ones are the Egyptians, the white ones are the Asians, the Syrians, the Greeks, everything that is northern. The yellow race is the Levites, the black race is the Africans. In fact, we remember why Seti came to power. Just recently, in the hymn to the sun, Akhenaten was told that the sun is seen by people and is praised in different languages and is seen by people of different races and nationalities. It seems that Seti, on the one hand, was fascinated by the depths of ancient Egyptian culture in the era of the ancient kingdom. He took some elements of Amarna and Amarna, which proclaimed for the first time that all nations see the sun and all nations glorify the sun in their own languages. This absolutely Amarna episode was taken into the logic of the royal tombs, and here in the 5th hour of the Book of Wrath it is. Let's move on. Look at what a beautiful sunbed on this wall, and we have again the foreknowledge on the bow of the Sia, on the stern of the Hikab, on the bow of the Magi. The great serpent of time, Mechan, with his zigzags, protects the body of Naos from the sun, and the sun here is Euphra, this great divine sunflower. In the main theme of the Book of Wrath, I think you have assessed the degree of detail of how the tomb is decorated. Look at the beauty of the doors themselves. Here are the doorways that protect the fiery cobras, these golden cobras. Look, it has a golden poison pouring out of its mouth. The door should open next to it. Here are the spirits with different heads, including the head of a jackal. The spells are read here. And here it is, the red door itself, and the huge serpent body rises vertically along this door in order to see if the sun is knocking on these doors. You know, if you turn off your imagination, of course, Hollywood will never film what was said about ancient Egypt. Imagine an absolute night, golden doors, these cobras, the doors begin to open. There are giant serpents standing on their tails, hissing so loudly that the echo in the ears of the sun's satellites is heard. Then the sun begins to call the names of the doors, of the gods, of the spirits, of the keepers, of the serpents. And at some point, the doors begin to open and let the sun into the space of the next hour. It's all very majestic and incredibly beautiful. By the way, we're coming back to this image, and below you can see not only the Egyptians in the lower register, but also the Asians, the first two figures in this image. The main theme of this image of the door element is time. What does it mean? The upper register is time like a rope that is infinitely wound, and this rope is carried by the gods in the duat. In the middle register, time is like a snake. This is the original concept of ancient Egypt, which dates back to the cult of the great snake Mehen. Games with time, such as round platforms for playing games, were known in Egypt since ancient times. Finally, below you can see the image of the nations. Now look carefully at the black Nubian. Despite the damage in front of him, there is a Libyan. The Libyan has a typical Libyan wig and two feathers stuck in his head. This is the end of the story with the nations, and in front of them there is another illustration of the Egyptians about time. We move on. So there is a rope at the top, a great snake in the middle, and a rope at the bottom, a rope in the form of a thick rope. And between the spirits that carry this rope, there is a strange image of a solar disk and a piece of a mast on it. This is how Ahau is read. Ahau is the lifespan. Ancient Egyptians believed that the lifespan was measured in millions of years, and only a small fragment of this lifespan is the earthly life. That is, the gods at the bottom carry time as a rope that is filled with millions of years of life and existence for all living beings. And then this scene follows the wall of this room. And finally, here, this is the scene that opens the image. A rope, a snake, and it turns out that the rope on which Ahau lives is also the great snake of time whose head is raised. All this process associated with the Egyptian understanding of time and the universe comes from the world of the gods. And the source of this life is the deity. I will now prove to you that this is exactly so. For now, let's look at the next part. This is the same room, just the right wall. This is the 6th part of the book, Wrath. Here is not only time, but also the righteous dead who lie on the snake of infinity in the embalmed, like mummies, burial masks, as if time for them is a burial bed. They will rise from their mummies with spirits in another world. And in the central register you see very interesting images of the gods whose hands seem to be hidden in such vests. If the text had not been preserved, we would never have guessed. The Egyptian symbolic series is very complex. They carry the body of an invisible god who emits light, but the body of this god cannot be seen or depicted. Just like on the recently seen painted reliefs carried by the snakes, carried by time, here they carry the body of a god who cannot be seen, who emits light, says the text. And it is in this register on the right where the sunbeam enters during its journey through this distant part of the new world. And here's what was very important to me before going to the next room. Look how interesting it is in the upper register. There is a deity, and the spirits of the night hours pull a rope out of his throat. This god, Aken, is one of the forms of the eternal deity, and in the book Vrat, Aken acts as the source of all life. And because the breath is given by the throat, and the throat in Egypt is connected with the breath, and the breath is life, this breath of life, like a divine rope, is pulled out of Aken's throat, so that the sun god would share this life with all those who are waiting for this life in their tombs, who are waiting for this life in their dreams, who are waiting for this life in their secluded dwellings in the deeper regions of the other world. And we are going to the next room where the images were not completed. There is also a fragment of the late text on the walls. There is Amduat, the 10th hour, but I will show you the unfinished pillars. The light is terrible, so it is difficult to see. But look at the beautiful goddesses of Mot. These are both sisters, two motes who stretch the breath of eternal life. Here too a red outline was made at first, and then a final sketch was made in red and black, and according to the final sketch, on the layers of plaster. In the tomb of Seti there were up to 3 layers of plaster. A stone surface pillar was made, then a rough plaster was applied, then a good plaster, and then a piece diluted in water. A piece is a plaster sifted to the state of dust, and then when all this plaster was solidified, a relief was made on it. That is why the reliefs in the tombs, including here, are so vulnerable. So 2 figures of the goddess Mot, and here I specifically use frames made in the 1950s where there is no such terrible light, and look how beautiful it is. Here on the left the king is in front of Osiris, and on the right in front of Pharaoh Osiris, and here, by the way, the primary red outline. Look at the hand and shoulders of Saqqara, and at the shoulders and head of the king. The logic is the same. Pharaoh Osiris, Seti, receives the sign of eternal life, and the main figure on the left here is a sacrifice. It literally says the doing of Ladin. Seneca is Ladin, that is, he burns a Ladin lamp. At the same time, this Ladin lamp in Egyptian art is also an allegory of Ba, that very entity which in the Western manner we call the soul. And here Seti, on the one hand, burns a Ladan lamp of his soul, and on the other hand, below, he infuses the sacred water from a luxurious vessel, which in its form reproduces the sign of eternal life. But this is one of the most beautiful Osiris in the tomb, despite the fact that it's not completed. The walls here, as I said, are illustrated by Amduat. Here is Amduat, the 10th hour, and every hour, every area is commented in the Egyptian text. This great God is here, in this place, in this way, in his water, and his companions row in it. The gods are those who, together with him, stay in the water in which his team rows. They breathe from the sound of his row, the divine commands. Immobility is death. Movement is life. Silence is death. Sound is life. That is, when the solar boat arrives in this part of another world, and the satellites of the solar boat row, then from this row begin to awaken from the state of mortal sleep the gods that are in this water stream, which is covered by the 10th hour. And the 10th area of the world is another, according to the text of the book of Amduat. Here, the satellites of the sun on his boat are described in detail. He reveals to the god Puaut, the god who reveals the ways, which you often remember. He is depicted as a desert wolf, but here's a completely anthropomorphic image. Then the second figure is Sia. This is the pre-eternal knowledge. Then Hathor Nebetuya, the ruler of the boat. Then, in fact, the sun itself, Euphra, and Mehen, the name of the snake, is signed here. The defender of the sun is Horthicanum, Kashu, Nessie, and so on. other deities who play an important role in the otherworldly journey of the sun god. Now look at this frame. It was made in 1953. This is the same room without backlighting. Evaluate, in fact, what the artists want to say, what the artists wanted to leave behind, who worked here, who worked in the first preset. That is, when this unevenness of the wall is not visible, then you see a completely fantastic room filled with gods, and these scenes represent the king before the gods of another world. We go down and I remind you of the plan of the tomb so that you understand that this is a descent to the left of the Hall of Four Pillars. Above us there is a central scene where the king prostrated before Osiris. Part of the walls of this descent are not removed, and part, unfortunately, was cut out and brought to the European Museum. In particular, there were two famous symmetrical slabs where the king greeted the goddess Hathor. One slab in Louvre, the other in Florence. And we will see these slabs at the final today. But Hathor meets the king at the next stage of this magical immersion into the space of another world. And in the next corridor, a very important experience awaits us, because this is where the ritual of opening the mouth and eyes begins. This ritual, which is known in Egypt from the deepest antiquity, ascends to 75 forms of the sun god to his 75 names. The ritual consists of 75 episodes. We'll talk about it now, but first I want to show you how the tomb suffered. Look, here's the scene where the king sits in front of the victim. The red thing on the victim is bread. They are depicted vertically, although they actually lie on the victim's pedestal. Then in two registers next to the bread, two priests of the late cult, the choir of Enmutef, the choir of the Mother Support, and the choir of Negetef, the choir of the Father's Protector, begin to lead this ritual, which then descends over the walls into the tomb. There is an early sketch of how Belzoni and his followers saw it. Look carefully at the frame. This is how it was. The image of the king died when in the 19th century they tried to cut him out and the wall collapsed. This image shows you the initial state of the tomb and the image that was here at some point. Let's go back to the symbolic series of this room of the tomb. I can't help but show you one of my favourite images. This is the choir of Negetef. He has a Levian wig and a beard, a huge bow of youth, as well as all the priests performing the function of Sem. The function of the priests for the late cult is stylized by the leopard skin. In a gesture of speech, he addresses Osiris, the king of Ossetia, and informs him that the ritual of opening the mouth and eyes, and if we try to describe some elements of this ritual in brief, we must first remember that it took place directly above the mummy. The mummy was brought to necropolis, then it was turned vertically. And the mummy or statue above the deceased statues also performed such rituals. Then this image was placed on a hill of specially selected sand manually. This hill symbolized Ben Ben, the original hill of the land on which Demiurge creates the universe. Then the mummy or statue, the object let's say, was purified with the help of natron. Natron is a natural mixture of soda and salt, which was used in all the rituals of Uobit, that is, in the rituals of purification. Then special magic passes were made when a ritual kiss, a knife made of meteorite iron, a divine stick of Urkikau, a great charm, a stick with an oval head, touched the mouth of the mummy to literally rip it off. That is, to force the internal structure of the human entity or entity of the statue as a divine image, to return again after death to the space of not only the ritual, but also to the space of complex relationships between our world and the world of K, this world of the double K, the world of vitality. Then, conditionally, they were watered with milk and oils, and then the animal was brought to the victim. and a pulsating blood of the heart or a front leg was brought to the lips. Because this is Africa, my friends, there's nothing here without magic and blood. And then this heart impulse, this magical substance that is in the blood, it must defeat death and give a purpose. What is the purpose of the ritual of opening the lips and eyes to give an opportunity to this entity in another world to function, to walk, to move, to look, to taste the offerings, to speak, to move freely in all areas? In the same way, when it comes to the statue, it is a complete inclusion of the statue into the ritual. That is, the statue becomes a new body for that spirit. I say very conventionally, using Western terms for this, which will enter the statue at the moment of worship. So let's look at some episodes. So here, the choir of Unmutef, the choir of the Mother of God, begins to lead this ritual. And here we see the set in the form of a statue. Look, please, the statue is installed everywhere as if on such a yellow pillow. This is the pillow. And there is the very sand that is picked up by hand. And here you see the first part of the ritual. Here is the anointing. Moreover, according to the text, the anointing should be done 4 times. 4 times, connected both with the 4 sides of the light and with the fact that in general the ritual of transition in Egypt was associated with the number 4. In particular, it was on the cycle subordinate to the number 4 that mummification was shared. The whole ritual of the anointing is based on this principle. So this is the purification. Let's move on. Here you see 3 priests. 3 is a multiplicative number, that is, there are many of them. These are priests in special clothes with transplants. And if they perform some part of the ritual in relation to the king, then another priest appears here, Herheb. He is the main one above them. Herheb is the priest who leads the ritual of transplantation of the lips and eyes. The interaction with the statue begins. Here is the bow of the sacrificial animal, and you see the front leg of this bull is cut off in order to raise its statue. And again, about this fact, in the lower register, the priest Sam, in the leather of a stylized leopard, speaks to the king. Here it is very interesting. Look, here it is depicted how the priests pass each other the heart and the bull's leg. The heart is in a bowl because it is with pulsating blood, and then the leg and the heart are raised to the statue, to the image of the king, in order to perform all that I have just told you. Look, here is another scene of raising the sacrificial bull's leg. Here in the turquoise frame, the title of this priest is given. Here it is written, Herheb. You see, he is a sign of his enlightenment. He holds a palette with a letter because he will be a part of the magical ceremonies to write on the image. Next, the man who carries the bull's leg. Above him it is written Sem. Next to him there is also the raising of the right front leg. Sem, remember, is a priest of the lake cult. And again, here is a stylized leopard skin. And finally, in the green frame, it is written Uperirti. This Uperirti is the name of the ceremonial opening of the mouth and eyes. This is what happens here. I comment on you and show you the upper register. You see that there is a ceiling on top. It goes down further into the tomb. Below are the comments. The ritual of opening the mouth and eyes was published by the outstanding German Egyptologist Eberhard Otto. All this is published in German. You can see everything if you speak German. So we move further along the tomb. And here is the end of this corridor. Above the passage there is the next room of the winged sun disk. The great god is what the inscription comments on. And that's it. Pay attention to the central scene. In this frame there is a priest, and he performs the ritual of anointing with oil. This extended hand with the little finger is always in the Egyptian canon anointing with the holy 7 oils of the god Nefertum. And here, accordingly, this anointing completes the ritual of which Seti did not just pass through the ceremony of opening the mouth and eyes, but the traces of death. That's it. There is no more death in it. All the connections between its subtle parts of the entity and its mind are restored, and so are the statues. Pay attention to the fact that all these images are included in Seti. Thanks to the fact that this is depicted on the walls of his tomb, the king always performs the ritual of opening the mouth and eyes so that death has no effect on him. We move on. We pass into a small room, very beautiful. And again we have the scenes of the feast. Here is the left scene of Seti before Osiris, who was the first among the Westerners, the first to pass through death and to gain this revival. In the centre there is a wonderful scene of Seti before the goddess Hathor, the ruler of Ivanovo. The right scene is of Seti before the god Hor, the son of Isis and Osiris. This small room is all covered with scenes of the feast. In the centre there is a wider circle of gods which Seti meets. Seti brings some offerings, but one way or another each deity promises something good, which this deity specifically gives to the king in this posthumous transformation. I can't help but please you with the details. Let's look at the central image. Seti brings the vessels of Nu. The vessels of Nu are the vessels with wine. The goddess Hathor has a characteristic Ramesses-style hairstyle. Take a closer look. It used to be colourful. The sun disk and the elements of her wig bear the shades of red. These are all fragments of the paintings that used to be here. Let me please you even more and show you the whole scene. Many of you will be sad when you see this. I made this shot on purpose a couple of years ago because the Europeans used to stand here and look at these images with candles and torches and burn their names, dates of the visit of the tomb. John was here, Mary was here, and the rest of the filth that was here in 1820 something. I can't understand what moved these people. I can't understand how they were supposed not to be touched, even if they were worried about the beauty, even if they didn't understand what was written here. Here are the two right scenes. The king is here before the jackal-headed deity. I can't see very well. Ah, yes, Anubis. I always don't want to get confused with Puao. There's Enipu, there's Anubis. And the second scene on the right is before Isida. She's the goddess of the sky, the goddess of all gods. We'll remember again that all this used to be colourful. The scene of Isida carrying a vessel with wine is very beautiful. I want to show you several large forms. I really like macros. Look at the face on one of these scenes. Even though it's distorted by the backlight, it's incredibly detailed. The lips, the nostrils, the incredible cosmetic lines of the eyes and eyebrows, the urethra on his forehead, the chin. Every hieroglyph that accompanies the king's ritual interaction with the god is like a small piece of art. On the other side, on the right side, and on the left side, there are different degrees of damage. But here too, there's a scene of a feast. I think you've already recognised the bird on the right, which I showed at the beginning of the lecture, whose face has been lost. There's a huge stopjet, and then there's a scene of a feast. On the right and on the left, there's Seti before Osiris, Seti before Hathor and Minted, Seti before Horus and Isisot, Seti before Isida, and Seti before Anubis. There's a very beautiful scene on the left where the image of Seti is almost destroyed, which is embraced by Hathor and Minted. And on Hathor and Minted and on the bird, the colour is a little preserved, so I'll do it like this so that you can see it and imagine how luxurious this room was when all the elements of the polychrome palette were present. And just a wonderful, beautiful face of Hathor and Minted. Look how she smiles when she looks at Seti, and there's nothing random here, there's nothing done, just technically. There's the experience of meeting the gods and the king who has finally returned to his heavenly abode. We finish our journey through this room. We move on. Unfortunately, there's a collapsed pillar on the left and on the right, where there was an image of Nefertum's god and a huge Theth, a node of the goddess Isis. Theth is on the left behind the board, and Theth is on the right behind Nefertum. There used to be doors here. And then we enter the most ceremonial part of the tomb, the entrance of the burial chamber. The entrance of the burial chamber is decorated with many pillars. All these pillars are covered with amazing images. Let's look at some of them. So the pillars at the entrance, on the left, the choir of Iun Mutef, which you already know, the choir of the support of his mother, the priest of the late cult who turns to Osiris in order to let Osiris into the world of Innos. On the right, the representation of Theth before the god of wisdom, the letter of the moon and magic. And here, look carefully, my friends, it's the same pillar, but on the left it's a modern shot, and on the right it's a shot from 1953 when there was no backlight. It's a shot made with a flashlight. Agree that the perception difference is completely different. On the left you see a beautiful but strangely backlighted image, and on the right it's the masterpiece that Theth's masters came up with. Here Theth stands before Osiris, and here we should pay attention to another very important thing. Look at the shot on the left, which is new. Osiris's wig, his hand, his torso, and the hip girdle. And look down, do you see the crack? And now look at the image from 1953. There's no crack. Then the king's torso was removed, the plaster was removed, the background was slightly restored, but nevertheless there are a lot of losses compared to 1953. And the worst thing about the tomb of Theth is that the burial chamber itself is huge. There is an unstable limestone, and the ceiling of this room hangs on metal fortifications because the collapse happened even in the 20th century. I hope you are interested in such comparisons, because thanks to these comparisons I show you much more exquisiteness of the monument than you can see with your own eyes when you get to the tomb that is just badly backlighted. I'm not talking about the unknown person who made this luminescent backlighting. I'm trying to explain to you how such things distort our perception of the masterpiece that was made in the 13th century before the new era. Here is another tomb that is badly preserved, but nevertheless there is a magnificent image of Theth, and in front of him is the god of sun, and they hold hands, and the sun touches the shoulder of Theth, the king of his earthly son, and his earthly likeness. In addition to the gods, there are such interesting images of kneeling anthropomorphic male figures with heads of jackals and falcons. This is not Anubis and not Hor, but Baufe and Nahon. These are the so-called souls of Pe. Pe is one of the names of the city of Buta in the north of the country, and Nahon is accordingly the city located in the south of the Nile Valley. This is a symbolic image of the ancient kings of Egypt who welcome their new incarnation in the face of Theth. They are always depicted on special stands, and they have a gesture of one hand clasped in the fist, knocking in the chest, and the other hand raised, clasped in the fist, to the sky. This is a gesture of Kenu, a gesture of praise. These are proto-kings of Egypt who have lost their names, lost their images, who have gained a new form in the form of such spirits with heads of jackals and falcons. At the same time, this is Upper and Lower Egypt. As you know, no one has abolished heraldry here. They are also present on these stands. Now, with the head of a jackal, with the head of a falcon, it will also be very soon a very beautiful image. On the right is a very preserved pillar where Theth appears before Osiris Hentiamentius. Before the first among the Westerns, Osiris Hentiamentius has a green face. He is coloured like a mummy. And the oldest description of the funeral ritual and the ritual of wrapping into a linen cloth is that it is in the light. On the head of Osiris, the crown of Atif, his parade headdress, here in fact Theth meets the source of life. The left frame is the god Shu, the god of air, one of the closest sons of the sun god. Air is breath. In both cases, it is the source of life for the essence of King Seti I in the other world. By the way, Shu has an incredibly beautiful face. Unfortunately, I'm talking to you now, and I regret that I didn't put a macro shot. I should have shown Shu's face. On the other hand, I will not forget to recommend that on the internet there are several funeral rituals made by Europeans to show this possibilities of virtual walking around the tomb. I don't like virtual walking because you can't show a macro shot there. You can't show all these details, but in order to get an impression of walking inside, you should find it. It's all free on the internet. Look at Shu's face. It's absolutely incredible. It's one of the most beautiful faces in the tomb of Seti I. On the walls of this door with pillars, we have a journey of the sun again. It's the Book of the Gates, the second hour. As you can see, the clock is not in order at all. And again, the sun meets us with the most important events in this night journey. In the lower register are captured forces of chaos. These are the enemies. These are those who oppose the sun. These are the spirits. These are not human souls who want to destroy the world. Here they are connected. Here they are abandoned. Next to them is the extreme left. The figure below is the god Atum. On top of it are floating their boats of millions of years of the sun. The satellites of the sun, the spirits of Duat, are dragging the boat to the space of the next region of the new world. Here is a very important scene. On top of it, look at how beautiful the mehen of snakes writhing in rings is framed by the central nose on the boat of millions of years. And at the bottom is the god Atum and the defeated snake Apop. This is the same Apop who opposes the sun, who in fact is a demon who personifies chaos, so that no one can confuse the good snake with the bad snake. Above the head of Apop, everything is written Apop. There is his name. Next to him is the god Atum. His name is also emphasized. And he, leaning on the staff, looks so tiredly at the snake Apop, which is defeated. Once the snake Apop is defeated, the book is closed for a third hour. Then the sun can continue to follow without hindrance. I will please myself and you. Now I will show you a macro shot. Look how interesting Apop is, how it is written, how it works to transfer the colours of the snake's body. It is absolutely amazing. And again, it is clearly seen that each hieroglyph, each inscription is a voluminous embossed sign, beautifully covered with a polychrome painting. Here are the spirits that continue the third hour of the Book of Gates. Here, 4 divine protectors meet on the path of the sun's boat, and at the top, on the shore of the fiery lake, there are red waters. From the stele the heads of the blessed spirits, and between them such wonderful sycamores grow. This is an illustration of what for the defiled spirits, for the spirits carrying the projection of bad deeds, is the fiery lake. In fact, for the righteous spirits, this lake is pure water in which the source of purification and the source of good life. And these people appearing from the stele are conditional. Here, instead of heads, there are black silhouettes as a sign that there are a lot of them. And this is just, how can I convey the image to you? Imagine that you are at the cemetery and a living person comes out of every grave and greets you. This is what is depicted here. Again, this is an illustration that shows the destruction of death and the prosperity of eternal life. This is, of course, an incredible masterpiece. We came to the cemetery. There, on the left, there is a hall next to the door. a hall of pillars, and the whole cemetery is made on a golden background, because this is the house of gold, Pernabu. This is the place where immortality reigns. The ceiling is astronomical. We will look at the ceiling separately today. First of all, I would like to draw your attention to the metal structure that holds the ceiling where there were serious collapses. This is a big problem because the tomb is large. This is one of the largest rooms, not only in this tomb, but also in the Valley of Kings. And here in this room, there used to be the travertine sarcophagus that I found in Bilson. I showed it in this plan. There are a huge number of images. First of all, here are the first hours of Amduat, the first hours of the book about what the night conceals for itself, the book about what the other world conceals for itself. That is, on the one hand, these are the important events of the night journey, but there are still a lot of things here. Let's talk about everything in order. On both walls, which are the end ones for this elongate room, there are huge winged figures of the goddess of protection, Isida, and Nephthys. Let's take a look at everything. So here are both walls. On the left is Isida, on the right is Nephthys. Next to the figures of the goddesses are the names of the king and the beginning of the prayers. The pale blue arrows show such strange chaotic notches. These 4 notches were actually closed and recorded later. These are niches for magic figures. Remember the magic figures found in the burial chamber of Tutankhamun's tomb in the same niches. These are the figures that magically revived and protected the king. And we're supposed to create a universe around his sarcophagus in the burial chamber. That is, he became Osiris, and this is the world around which this world revolves. These niches are visible here, the registers of the corresponding hours of the night, and here are the most different sunflower transformations, various deities. We will see the fragments now. Let's do it. But first, look at how beautiful Isida is. This is the top of one of the walls. This is one of the most beautiful images of the winged goddess Isida, the great mother of God who unites with life in vulnerability, power and strength, which gives him the radiance of a similar aura. And of course, this palette was miraculously preserved here. On the other hand, you can clearly see the cracks on the walls. This is unfortunately what you can't do anything with. This is a tomb that is alive, moving limestone, where the mountains are moving. The Fivan mountains are very old, and from time to time, so-called tafla is formed in the mountains. This limestone turns into sand, and when the tafla falls, the mountain sits down. That is, the mountains move. That I explained to you my understanding that the Fivan necropolis slowly descends, slowly fades away. So we are very lucky that we see all this in such a state. So I'm showing you a fragment, and accordingly the turquoise frame shows where it is on the wall. This is the first hour of Amduat, and this is the ascent. This is what is very important for understanding immortality. Here's the sunbed in the centre of the scarab's bed, and on both sides the scarab's figure is flanked by 2 images of Osiris and Ira. Do you remember the union of Osiris and Ira in the body of the one God, the Eternal? Here the division has already happened, and here Osiris in fact blesses the sun for a new sunrise, for a new day cycle. That is why the masters and the authors of the tomb transferred this image together with the first hour of Amduat to the burial chamber. That is, it is a guarantee of immortality, and the morning will come in any case. The morning will come. That is, it is not just a burial chamber, but a house of immortality, a house of gold in which the ascent is expected. In general, it is a completely different symbolism. It is not about death at all. It is about eternal life. Nearby there are sacred snakes great baboons which welcome the sun at the ascent, protective snakes and so on. The first fragment of this wall, a very beautiful fragment. And again, this frieze, I show you where it comes from. Let's look on the left. On the left is the nose of the solar boat. It is floating. By the way, it is also interesting for your understanding the image of the solar boat. That is, it is the golden boat of millions of years. And you see on the nose such a strange rectangle. In fact, these are beads which are attached to the nose of the boat of millions of years. When it soars, that is, when the solar boat floats, it rings. That is the ringing of these sacred beads on the nose. And then there are two figures of the goddess Mat, and they differ only in the colour of the dress. Solar, red and green, are the colours of eternal life. Then there is the god protector, the angry one, who must protect the sun with a knife. Then the first among the Western gods is Osiris. Then there is the lion-headed goddess Semet. She is also one of those who protects. Then there is the owl-headed god Svit and the sun. Most of all, I am interested in these four strange objects. You have already realised that it resembles stela with the heads of the righteous. But we have a commenting thing here. These are the revived texts written on stone. These are the texts of wisdom of Osiris, wisdom of Hipri, wisdom of Atum, and wisdom of Ra. And again, there are four texts, four sides of the light and the perception of the Egyptians of the number four as a complex of four hypera. Hypera is a form of manifestation of some phenomenon. The four hypera is a kind of complex that allows to understand the manifestation of something in its entirety. So here, these four wisdoms of Osiris, Hepri, Atum and Ra are represented as a complex of the original wisdom that is present here in such a personified form in this stage of the night journey. Above the door in the side room, there is a very beautiful image of Seti before Rakara. Look how beautifully above Seti another solar disk is depicted, decorated with urea. But this disk is smaller because according to the canon of the Egyptian representation of the royal power, Seti Menma'atra is the younger, the little earthly son. He brings urea to Rakara, and in return he is given everything he wants. Here is life, indomitability, power and health. And the most important thing here is the healing of the heart. And life is like urea in eternity. Nisha. There is clearly a statue of Caliban or some other very important cult image. On the backside of Nisha here is Osiris Hentia Mintio. He is depicted between two emblems of Emut, which is associated with the cult of Anubis. Actually, Anubis himself is in front of him, and he performs the ritual of rejection of the lips. He brings the acid Setep to the lips of the mummy of Osiris, which is here on the sign of truth, the sign that he is already justified. Here in the burial chamber, in the special niche, the most important element of the ritual of rejection of the lips and eyes is brought out. We turn to the other side of the burial chamber. Here, by the way, on the pillar, there is another spirit. Here he is with a falcon head, what I told you about. And the rest of the space of the walls of the tomb is a few more hours of the book of Amduat. Here is a fragment of the second hour of Amduat. Here are very interesting gods who are depicted embalmed, but in their invisible glowing hands they hold the symbols of eternal life. Moreover, in the centre, together with Osiris, Anubis is depicted as the Lord of the Holy Land, as the Lord of Necropolis, and therefore he himself is shown here embalmed, buried in the ashes. On the middle register there are boats that make up the sunlight, and here are the important satellites of the sun. First of all, the lunar boat, one of the most beautiful images in the tomb of Seti Vig. Here you see at the same time an image of a lunar disk and a lunar serpent followed by a stylized ostrich feather of the goddess Ma'at. The spirit keeps the moon as the source of the world order. This is how you can interpret this image. Behind the lunar boat, there is another very beautiful boat. This is the boat of the goddess Kadkor. Look at the golden emblem with an unmarked face. It is kept by the goddess on the bow of the boat Scarabée. If you're watching our journey closely now, you should recognize that the bow and the bowler are decorated with the portraits of the god Shu, the god of air. The thing is that Shu and another god, who can also have the same crown in Hara, are connected with the legend about how they returned the goddess Kadkor when she got angry at her son father and went far away. The return of the golden goddess of love as a feminine principle of the world order is connected with the obligatory representation of the return of eternal life. So this boat contains the whole idea of the return of Kadkor to Egypt through a number of such symbols. This is the whole process. Here's the boat of Osiris with the consecrated crocodile. Then there are two more boats of the sun. On one boat, on the other, on the left, the great goddess Sycamore. This is Nut. And the last boat, I'll show it to you in detail. Look at this beautiful sun boat. Here is Asida and Neftida on the nose and the image of a cobra. Then the anthropomorphic Upuat. Then Seal. Then Kadkor Nabet and Uye, the lord of the boat. And then all the other companions and Ufra himself. And here his name is written. Ufra is written inside Nous. He stands. And his gizmo here is a magic snake to which he supports the power of creation. Let me show you one frame with my own person so that you can imagine the volume of this room. It's really huge. Of course, when you are there, this is really a feeling of complete immersion into some secret abyss, into an incredibly beautiful world. This is insanely beautiful. Photographs never convey this, and of course I admire that it's all inside the rock, deep inside the rock, and yet it was done by the masters of the set on such an absolutely incredible, unattainable for most masters of the tomb level who make this tomb a masterpiece. And here's another shot from the wall of the burial chamber so that you can feel the volume, that it's all not flat, that it's all not just coloured, it's all voluminous. Here it is in the space of the most various boats of the first hours. This is the second hour. The ceiling. The ceiling here is amazing, and throughout the history of Egypt, the ceiling solution of the ceilings of the burial chamber has changed. At first there were just stars, then by the 19th dynasty, by the first epoch, this canon appeared of the northern and southern parts of the sky. Later, by the 12th century, before the new era, images from the great heavenly books will appear here. And this is the tomb of Ramses IV, the tomb of Ramses II, and so on. Let's take a look at what is depicted here. Let's start with this image. Of course, the figure of the syncretic goddess. This is what is conventionally called a behemoth. In fact, it's not a behemoth because it has a body of a behemoth and a head of a behemoth. It has a lion's paw, a crocodile's tail. This is the Egyptian part of the tomb, which is associated with astronomy. This is the polar star of the ancient world, the polar star Tuban. It has a crocodile on its shoulder, on its arm. Another crocodile, Hetepredoi. Next to it is an inverted image of the beehive of the goddess An. These are the current constellations of the swan. A little higher, the bull is Meshitiu. This is one of the constellations associated with the possibility to penetrate beyond the sky into another world. For us, the tomb is deep in the rock, and from a magical point of view, for a Seti who lies in his sarcophagus, imagine that the walls are filled, they float around the boat, and the sky opens above it. And this goes back to the very old Egyptian canon, when it was said that the sky is written above you. the sky opens up, and in order for him to go out to the world of gods and ancestors, he does not need to leave the tomb. He goes out to the ceiling, there, into these images of the starry sky, which are so beautiful, so exquisite here. The goddess Opet, this syncretic deity with the body that combines the features of the body of a crocodile, a lion, and a hippopotamus, is the angry form of the goddess Nut, the mother of Osiris. This is not Tort. Tort is close to Opet, but Opet plays a completely different role in the Egyptian religion. They're very often confused. And here Opet, who is also sometimes understood as Isida Hesamut, Isida, mother of thorns, this is the heavenly form of Isida. She holds in her front paws the severed leg of Seth, so that Seth, like chaos, does not recover, so that he is not whole. And while he is not whole, he will not be able to triumph over Osiris. Here is another additional meaning of this image. These are the northern stars. Here is the southern part of the ecliptic. Here is a very beautiful scene in the lower left corner. This is Azida Sepadet. This is the golden Sirius, which rises as a sign of the triumph of Osiris over death. And in front of Sirius, the high crown, the male figure, also the Lord, which turns to Isida. This is Sa. This is Orion. This is the heavenly image of Osiris. And in front of them is a whole procession of gods, defenders of different forms, of Horus and Isida. And unfortunately, look at the terrible crack here on this part of the vault. Therefore, the tomb is in very poor condition. We are in the burial chamber zone, but we have side rooms. These side rooms are very important. Let's look at the first one, which is now shown by the blue arrow. This is a passage usually not closed for tourists. And here is the book Wrath, the fourth hour, and the central image is very interesting. Below are the fire furnaces in which the spirits burn the demons and the forces of chaos. It is from here, apparently, early Christianity took the idea of hell, which was not originally in ancient Egypt. And in the centre, there is another very interesting image of the serpent of time, which is woven with incredible loops. It rises from the water abyss, and on the shore of this lake in which the serpent splashes, there are goddesses of the hour of the night. 12 o'clock at night, each of which has, as you understand, its own symbolism. Another opposite small room, but very interesting. This is a passage from the book of Genesis, and here is a passage from the book of Genesis, and here is a passage, and here is a passage from the book of Genesis, and here is a passage from the book of Genesis, and here is a passage from the book of Genesis. So long as the serpent turns to the goddess with the wind in its hair, which causes her harm, then this whole story about the transformation of a female deity from peaceful to an beast is also recorded in the book of Genesis. Here, see how interesting it is. It would seem that this mythological construct is incredibly important for ancient Egypt. We have it recorded in 3 different sources. One of them is the Treaty of Temchamon. This is the image in the tomb of Seti I, and another short image in the version of the tomb of Ramses III. Unfortunately, this cow was very popular with Europeans. They tried to take prints of it countless times, and in the end it turned out to be black like this. I'll show you how it looked at first, but first I want to please you with the details. Many figures of the god Shu, the air god, hold the cow's belly. The lower part of the cow's belly is covered with stars, and next to it is the sun god Ra himself floating on his boats. According to the legend, the goddess, the daughter of the sun, turns into a cow. The gods sit on their golden boats or on her back, only between her horns, and she rises into the heavenly spheres, separating the world of gods from the world of people forever. This is a detailed elaboration of all the elements. All the spirits are sign. It's absolutely amazing. This is how the scene looked like at first. Look at the copy made by Nicola Ritchie. The white background is the golden cow. And the fact that the prints were constantly taken from it, the white background was removed and the cow became black. When you enter this room, the cow looks very gloomy. In fact, there is no golden cow on the white background that emits light. This is all that Belzoni and the first people who were in this tomb at that time saw. Finally, a very important room. The blue arrow is showing it now. This is a side chamber with 2 pillars. In fact, it performs the crypt function of the tomb. And now we will go there with you and see everything that is related to the world of Osiris, because everything in the set became Osiris. And for him, this world of Osiris, the world of his legend, is especially significant. The hall of 2 pillars looks like this. On the pillars, unfortunately badly damaged, the king is depicted worshipping Osiris and merging with Osiris. I will now show you the images that have been preserved. Look around the perimeter of the hall. There is a pedestal, and on this pedestal there were the most important offerings for the dead. Moreover, if we look closely at the walls, here are the most secret images. For example, the Book of Amduat is the 6th hour. This is the reunion of Osiris and Ra, the central register. There is a snake with many faces. He is Ashaheru. You see that he has many heads, and there lies the body of Osiris, on the head of which there is a scorpion. This is a symbolic image of the reunited deity. Near the celebration of the gods, spirits, there are snakes, secret gods who illuminate this secret region of the new world. For example, one of the gods is Atum, the second is Hepri, the third is Shu, the fourth is Geb, the fifth is Osiris, the 6th is Hor, the 7th is Upaut, and another one is Hetapi, twice pacified. In the image of these fire snakes, the most important deities of the Egyptian pantheon are shown, and on top are the tombs of Osiris. These are the Assyrians, and somewhere the head of Osiris, somewhere the back of the body of Osiris, somewhere his hands and wings. This is an image of the most important saints associated with Osiris. The god of the sun appears here in the image of a lion, which is great to the rics, and here are still kept and existing in anthropomorphic form scepters, crowns, that is, the 7 insignia of kings and queens. And in the lower register, a snake that gives life. And then these 4 heads, these are the insets of Hepi, Duamotep and Quebec sons, the sons of Hor, who are associated with the sending of the correct ceremonial embalming, and at the same time they keep the northern gates of heaven. A very interesting wall. First, look how black the symbols of the transformation appear here. The lower register, changing jet, tet, tet, jet, jet, tet, tet, jet, jet, as a symbol of Osiris, tet as a symbol of Isis, all together with Shetau, the trinity of the transformation. The Book of Amduat, the 7th hour. In the 2nd register, above Jet and Tet, sits Racharachte, and before him go the hours of the night. Each of them has a star on its head, and in the scene above, the collapse of chaos is repeated once again. There is the overthrow of Apop. Apop is all covered with images of knives with which his spirits cut him. And if you pay attention to the screen, and I'll show you the macro shot later, there, in addition to all the satellites of the sun, on the bow of the boat is Isis, who turns his hands to Apop and begins to cast a spell on him. Because you need not just to overthrow Apop, you need to take his eye away from the sun, which is the source of all sorts of contempt, corruption, and all sorts of other evil deeds. At the same time, near Apop's neck stands the goddess Selkith, who holds his fabric as a sign that later, when he is overthrown, Selkith will heal Apop, will sew him up again so that this cycle of life would repeat again. And then on top, in a sort of snake's frame, there is the triumphant Osiris. In front of Osiris, on his knees, stand his beheaded enemies. They are no longer alive here. And with great rage, the god with the head of a cat, he in fact overthrows these 3 enemies of Osiris. 3 means a lot. This is a symbolic transfer of the multiplicity of the enemies of Osiris. Let's look at the fragments. So here's our god cat, and here are the enemies of Osiris who have been overthrown 3 times, the central part. And now you can see everything clearly. Agree to the gesture of Asida with his arms outstretched. He is absolutely amazing. And here is Apop himself and the goddess Selkith. Everything is signed by her, who holds Apop's neck with this fabric. Apop is all cut here, already on the part. Osiris himself, who is here with a great flesh, who has united his greatness, and he has the sign of this kind of shuti on his head, and the guardian of him is the goddess of the snake with a human face. Now the next wall is an image of great relics, royal souls, and again here are all the enemies of Osiris, and there are the hours of the night. Here are the overthrown enemies of Osiris, and the goddesses with fire knives are below, guarding the duat. Royal souls, royal bows. There are 3 of them. That is many. And on each head there is a crown of the upper and lower Egypt, according to the scheme. And the boxes are all the sacred relics of Osiris. The next wall is the 8th hour of the Amduat, 4 great ovens which keep the essence of life and are dedicated to the god Shu. The gods of the upper register sit on the signs of the overthrown duat. They keep the secrets of another world. Below is an image of the spirits and sacred snakes, including those that illuminate the space for the well-to-do Ahu. That is, for those entities, for those spirits who have passed all the post-mortem transformations safely. Another area where the Shemsu are represented here. This sign, the middle register, and it is repeated several times there, the sign to which the heads are suspended, is the Shemsu, a sign that personifies the companions of Ra, the companions of Osiris, and the companions of Hora. And here, on the preserved image, on the central pillar, there is the triumph of Seti, who somewhere worships Osiris and somewhere becomes him. On the left is Osiris standing on the sign of the truth between the 2 emblems of Anubis and Mut. This is Osiris, the first among the West, and the one who sits on the throne is Seti, who became Osiris, as it is written, and given to him the term of life of Ra, rich in years. He became Osiris, he conquered death, he corrected death and triumphed as a living god. And in the sign of this he has the same green face as Osiris, for he has a grown grain. He has a grain that with its sprout won the great death, which turned out to be a great one, unlike life. And as a sign that this hall is associated with the confirmation of Osiris and Seti, we turn to the wall and go back to the burial chamber. Look at the area that I highlighted in the turquoise rectangle. There is a large royal title, Tsar of Upper and Lower Egypt, Tsar Osiris Menmatra, righteous before Osiris, son of the sun, from his flesh, Seti Merneptah. On the left and right of the burial chambers, on the left Upper Egypt, on the right Lower Egypt, although both are depicted here as the female of the neck. At the same time, both empresses, both great goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt, they extend the sign of the life of the Ankh to the falcon sitting on the sign of Serech. The sign of Serech is the sign of the royal palace. It is filled with gold inside, and this is the first name of the royal title. In fact, the falcon sitting on the sign of the palace, Serech, is the representation of Tsar Seti Menmatra as the new earthly incarnation of Hor. Accordingly, his name is written there. He is Kanakt Ha'em Waset, a mighty bull in shining fur. Moreover, his name in the lower part, a very beautiful epithet. He is Sanctaui, and it is written with enigmatic in the form of a rebus. Sanctaui, he has given life to both lands. Ka Nakta M Waset Sanctaui. This is the first triumphant name of Hor, Tsar Seti, who was Hor and became Osiris and thereby gained immortality. The part that ends the tomb is a grandiose underground passage that leads from the central part of the burial chamber to the abyss. If you measure the entire tomb with this passage, it is 194.5 metres long, the longest tomb in the Tsar's Valley. There were legends about this passage. Beltsoen wrote that he regretted that he could not clear it. He thought that the treasure of Tsar Seti was hidden there. This passage was full of large stones. Finally, in the middle of the 20th century, there were legends about this underground passage among the residents of the village of Kurn, residents of the Fivan necropolis, which were associated with archaeologists, representatives of the same family, Abdul Rasul, who once found the secret of the Tsar's tomb. They raised money and in 1961 received permission from the Service of Antiquity to clear this underground passage. They could only reach half of it. People suffocated there, fainted. You can imagine that this narrow rock passage, which led somewhere to the abyss, they worked without masks, without equipment that would fit oxygen. As a result, Abdul Rasul refused this idea. This idea was implemented in our century by Dr. Zai Kavas. Here is this passage that was cleared, and then this passage rested. Everyone really wanted to find the treasure of Tsar Seti. It rested in a large false door, carved in stone, on which there was one single inscription, that is the secret tomb. For Seti, it was a descent into the none, a descent for his cave, for his entity, into another world. And considering how unusual things that Seti did, an unusual temple in Abydos, an unusual temple in Kurnia, quotes from the texts that have defended him for a couple of millennia in antiquity, even his tomb was made with such a secret passage for his entity, which led from the burial chamber to the abyss, which gave a lot of difficulties to all those who tried to solve one of his amazing riddles. Remember, at the very beginning, I told you such a funny thing, that in Belsonia, when he opened the tomb, there were a lot of things that originally belonged to the burial of Seti. There was no gold there. Besides the sarcophagus, there was a lot of other things. There are more than 700 tombs that are now kept in different museums around the world, and there is a very beautiful faience in Seti Vern's tomb. It is depicted in the image of Osiris in Nemesis with the matagas with which the tomb will work in Marino, the central tomb of the Metropolitan Museum. The far left tomb of the unpreserved legs is a British museum, and the very simple wooden tomb on the right was sold at the Bonhams auction in 2013. By the way, there is a similar wooden tomb of Seti I in Moscow at the Museum of Fine Arts of Pushkin. It is exhibited in the hall. Belsonia took these tombs in a box and a bag and gave them away as gifts. He gave all these tombs to the Vatican Museum. This is also a tomb of Seti Pen. They are of different classes. Here, this wooden tomb is covered with ritual black resin. They are all signed. So, I know a lot of museums in the world where there is at least a piece of Seti I's tomb. There are quite a lot of them in British private collections because Belsonia gave away such tombs as souvenirs to those who came to his exhibition in Piccadilly. So in fact, there are quite a lot of these elements of Seti I's tomb all over the world. Coming to the slow conclusion of today's story, I have to show you the things that were taken out of the tomb. First of all, these three slabs. The central slab is from the Louvre. Unfortunately, it was cut out by Champollion himself during the famous expedition to Egypt by Frank Toscansky. The left one is a pair of slabs. These two images were opposite each other. I've specified where it was in the tomb. And the left one is in the Archaeological Museum of Florence. According to Mussolini's order, it was restored in the 1930s. It was finished and covered with wax. That's why it has such a strange colour, burgundy, orangish. This thing needs to be restored, although it's also very beautiful if you take it off in good light. Finally, the third slab on the right is what Richard Lepsius took out in the 19th century to the Berlin Museum. Here you can see that the slab cracked several times when it was cut out of the limestone. Initially, this representation of Setius in front of Osiris Chintamenti, who gives him power like the power of Osiris, that is, the power like that of the sun god, was once one of the pillars in the doorway to the burial chamber. It's curious that more than 2,000 small fragments were found in the burial chamber, and they are pointless. These are small fragments, 5 by 10, that is, a tourist came to the burial chamber, saw a piece lying around and took it with him. This is a breach of privacy. Then, when the necropolis areas were cleared, there were more than 850 small fragments. All of them are now stored in the archaeological preservation of the western coast of Kurnia. Perhaps in time they will find their places where they once were in the burial chamber. Finally, another very famous image from the burial chamber of Setius of Thane, also stored in Florence. This is the magnificent goddess Maat. This is probably one of the most beautiful Maats that have survived from Egyptian art. Now remember those two Maats that were sketches in the hall that was unfinished. It started with such a sketch and ended with such an incredible image, a voluminous one covered with pigment. And the goddess is presented here in a very dignified way. In my opinion, this is an absolute masterpiece. This is the plate that Champollion carried to the Louvre. Setius, in a parade wig, touches the necklace of Manat, which the goddess Hathor is wearing. The necklace consists of many green beads. It symbolises immortality. Hathor is wearing a multi-layered, 4-layered wig made of dark blue and golden hair. Her head is wrapped around a ribbon. This is a ribbon. The word Nehek is repeated many times there. It means eternity. She is the sun goddess. The sign of this is on her head and ears. There are golden earrings. Aret is a sun urea, which embodies the feminine power of the sun god. Finally, on the goddess's shoulders, on the shoulders of Setius, there are magnificent wide earrings. And on his hands we can see how gracefully and subtly the translucent plaited linen he is wearing is transferred. And as a symbol of the Tsar's power, there is a great sacred snake on his forehead. It is impossible to move away from this monument, which is exhibited in the Louvre in good light. And looking at all these fragments, you are once again amazed at the skill with which this tomb was once made. Just recently, a new stage of her research began in the tomb. A Spanish team called Factum Arte scanned the tomb completely. The tomb was scanned completely. This is the process of scanning. This is a frame from their archive made in the burial chamber, and then a volumetric model was made. The tomb, which was presented in Switzerland for the first time in 2017 to the 200th anniversary of Giovanni Pelzoni's discovery. At first, only the volume of the relief was scanned, and then the colour was applied. Look how interesting it is. This is a fragment of the goddess in the burial chamber. This is Isida. This is how it looks colourless. And here you can see all the changes in the rock soil, the changes in the plaster. And then you see the already applied colour. But you know, I'll be honest with you, this project gave a lot to our understanding of how the tomb was made. The question was raised again about the need for new conservation. cleaning and so on. But, when the model of the tomb was presented with the first one, the tomb did not work out. I mean, it turned out visually it's an exact copy, but the feeling that the real tombs in the Valley of Kings give is not there. Arthur Weigel, a remarkable archaeologist who for many years was an inspector of the Western Coast, an inspector of the Valley of Kings, wrote that there is something in the Egyptian tombs that makes their visits absolutely incredible. Either dust or echoes or steps or these gloomy shadows that they are filled with. There's a completely different atmosphere. But the Project Factum Arte played a big role in understanding how much it is necessary to conserve the tomb from the first one. This is one of the elements of the project. Candles were placed inside the model in Switzerland to, on the one hand, imagine what the exhibition looked like at the Bell Zone, and on the other hand, here is a fully restored pigment, the Hall of Beauty, the Hall of the Residence of Seti, how it used to be. And think again, forgive me for being boring, because the Europeans who visited the Bell Zone in the 1820s, they saw this, and they left behind what is needed. Despite all its elegance and beauty, the most complex conservation, restoration, cleaning, and so on. This is an important element of the life and fate of the monument. When you leave the tomb, there is a great place around the Valley of the Kings, Tacitat. Yes, it is a completely different landscape. There is no great sycamore, and there are no Magi guards, who were a special detachment that guarded the great Tsar's necropolis. But over the Valley of the Kings still rises Deschenais, the great top of the west, according to the legend, on which lives Merit Segar, the goddess of love and silence, the great defender of the necropolis. Looking at this tomb, at the great masterpiece that was made by the masters for Seti Menmatra, looking at other tombs which impress, looking at the treasures of the tomb of Tutankhamun and many other finds that were made here, you involuntarily ask yourself a question. What fantastic masterpieces were in these rock rooms when Seti was buried here, when his son, Ramses the Great, how much grief was there? How many tears were shed here on these stone slabs of the gorge when the great burial procession? And finally, what seems to me the most important, how many hopes for the great immortality were invested in these walls, carved in these stones, at the foot of the rock, which in its form essentially repeated the very Ben, the pyramid of the original homes on which the sun god again and again creates the universe. And yet the final frame will be from the tomb itself. Here is Tsar Seti embracing the rare form of Osiris of Sarasutra. And my last words in this lecture will probably be connected with that very atmosphere, with that very feeling. When you change the angle a little bit, you see a completely different glare of light on the faces when you see the volume. And at some point, if you study or know the ancient Egyptian language and know these texts, all this tomb becomes not just a masterpiece, not just a dream of Seti, but an absolutely active canvas. When the Tsar stands before the gods, when he makes a sacrifice to them, when he asks them for mercy and eternal life, and the gods answer and call him to this great dream of immortal life, inside which Seti Menmatra